Hello friends, did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Sheriff Aubrey Thiot sat in his office at the Plamin's Parish Sheriff's Department, staring at a map of the bayou corridors that snaked through his jurisdiction like veins through aging flesh. The map was old. The paper yellowed and cracked at the folds, but it showed details that newer digital maps didn't bother with anymore. Small ferries that still ran on cables and goodwill. Backwater channels where the water turned black under the cypress canopy. Houses that appeared on no tax rolls inhabited by families whose names hadn't changed in 200 years. Thiot had been sheriff for 11 years, and before that he'd worn a deputy's badge for another 14. He knew this parish the way a surgeon knows scar tissue, understanding not just what was visible, but what lay beneath the old wounds that never quite healed. Right. Plaque means stretched like a crooked finger pointing into the Gulf of Mexico, a place where land and water conducted endless negotiations, where hurricanes rewrote geography every few years, and where certain understandings between people mattered more than any law written in Baton Rouge. The call came through at 21:17 in the afternoon. Dispatcher Celeste Stein Dupre's voice crackled over the radio, with that particular flatness she used when something wasn't sitting right. Sheriff got a report from the Bellechasse ferry operator. Says there's been activity at the old Point Allahache crossing. Vehicles coming and going at odd hours. Thought you'd want to know. Thiot picked up the radio. What kind of vehicles? Celeste Stein didn't say specifically, but Marcel Guidry made the call himself. And Marcel doesn't call about nothing. That was true enough. Marcel had been running that ferry for 30 years, inherited the job from his father, who'd inherited it from his father before him. The Guidry family knew every vehicle that crossed their cables, every face that rode across that brown water. If Marcel was calling, it meant something had broken the pattern. Tell him I'll drive out there tomorrow morning early. Will do, Sheriff. Thiot set the radio down and returned his attention to the map. The Point Allahache crossing was one of the older ferry routes, servicing a road that most people didn't even know existed anymore. It connected two pieces of parish land, separated by a wide bayou channel, linking a handful of houses on one side to the main highway on the other. Most of the families who lived out there had been there since before roads were paved, before electricity reached the deeper bayou communities. They were fishermen, trappers, people who made their living from the marsh and didn't ask much from the government except to be left alone. Deputy Jules Arsenault knocked on the doorframe. He was young, maybe 30, with the kind of lean build that came from growing up on the water. His family ran shrimp boats out of Empire, and he joined the department 5 years back after a bad hurricane season convinced him that steady pay might be worth trading the independence of the shrimping life. Heard Celestine on the radio. Arsenault said, "You want me to ride out to Pointe Allahache with you tomorrow morning 4:30 before the ferry starts running?" Arsenault nodded. He understood, as anyone who'd grown up in the parish understood, that timing mattered. There were things you saw at certain hours that you wouldn't see at others. The bayou kept different schedules than the rest of the world. That evening, Thiot drove home along Highway 23, the road that formed the parish's spine, running parallel to the river levee. The sun was setting over the marsh to the west, turning the sky the color of blood oranges. He passed fish camps and fuel stops, small churches with cemeteries where the graves were built above ground because the water table was too high for proper burial. He passed the turnoff to the old Point Allahache ferry and noted, as he always did, the absence of streetlights on that particular road. His house sat on a piece of high ground, relatively speaking, in a neighborhood that had been rebuilt after Katrina. His wife had died 6 years ago, cancer, and his daughter had moved to Houston for college and never come back except for holidays. The house felt larger than it should, rooms that echoed with absence. He ate dinner standing at the kitchen counter, catfish he'd fried himself, and went to bed early. The alarm went off at 3:45 a.m. He dressed in the dark, strapped on his service weapon, and drove through empty streets to the department. Arsenault was already there, leaning against his patrol unit with a thermos of coffee. They didn't speak much on the drive south. Both men watching the darkness give way to the grey pre-dawn light that made the marsh look like something half-remembered from a dream. They reached the turnoff to the ferry at 5:20 a.m. Theot killed his headlights and rolled slowly down the gravel road. The ferry dock appeared through the mist that rose from the bayou, a simple concrete platform with a small shack where Marcel Guidry collected the crossing fee. The ferry itself was tied up on the far side, a flat barge just big enough for 2 vehicles, pulled across the channel by a cable system that had been there longer than Theot had been alive. They parked in a stand of willows about 50 yards from the dock and waited. The morning sounds of the marsh built around them. Birds calling from the cypress, something splashing in the shallows, the diesel rumble of a shrimp boat working its way up the bayou toward the Gulf. At 6:15 they heard an engine. A pickup truck appeared from the direction of the houses on the far side, pulling onto the ferry. Marcel Guidry emerged from his shack. A thick man in his 60s wearing rubber boots and a saint's cap. He operated the controls, and the ferry began its slow crossing, the cable creaking under the strain. The truck was a Ford F-250, maybe 10 years old, heavily used. 2 men sat in the cab. Theot couldn't make out their faces from this distance, but he noted the license plate, committed it to memory. The ferry reached the near side and the truck rolled off, turning north toward the highway without stopping. "You get that plate?" They asked. "Got it," Arseno said, already writing in his notebook. They waited another hour. 3 more vehicles crossed, all heading in the same direction, all in the same pattern. Trucks mostly loaded with something heavy, judging by how they sat on their suspension. None of the drivers stopped to talk to Marcel. None of them lingered. At 7:30, Theod started his engine and drove down to the dock. Marcel was back in his shack, sitting on a folding chair with a newspaper spread across his lap. He looked up as Theod approached, and something passed across his face that might have been relief, or might have been resignation. "Sheriff Marcel, you called about activity out here." "Yeah." Marcel set the newspaper aside. "Been going on about 2 months now. Started small, maybe 1 truck a week. Now it's daily, sometimes twice, 3 times a day. You know any of the drivers?" Marcel shook his head slowly. "That's the thing. Usually I know everybody who crosses. But these guys, they're not from around here. They pay cash, don't say nothing, and they're always in a hurry." "Where do they come from?" Marcel gestured toward the far side of the bayou. "There's an old fish camp back in there about 3 miles down the Shell Road. Belongs to the Troclair family, but they haven't used it in years. I asked around and nobody knows who's using it now." Theot felt something. Marcel's expression went carefully neutral. "No, sir, and I don't ask." That neutrality told Theod everything he needed to know. Marcel had seen something, or suspected something, and had made the calculation that certain questions were better left unasked. It was a calculation people in the parish made all the time, a survival instinct honed over generations. Theot pulled out his wallet and handed Marcel a business card. "You see anything else unusual, you call me directly. Don't go through dispatch. Hand Marcel. If anyone asks if I've been out here, you tell them yes. No point in pretending otherwise." Marcel took the card and nodded. The honesty in that last statement seemed to ease something in him. In a place where silence was currency, being told to speak the truth was its own kind of permission. Theot and Arseno drove back to the main highway. Neither spoke until they were well away from the ferry crossing. "What do you think they're running?" Arseno finally asked. "Could be a lot of things. Drugs, stolen goods, untacked seafood." Theot paused. "Could be people." Arseno was quiet for a moment. "You want to call the state police or the DEA?" "Not yet. Soon as we bring in outside agencies, word spreads. And if this is what I think it is, these people have been operating here because they know how to keep the parish quiet. The minute they think we're bringing in the feds, they'll disappear like smoke. So what do? We take a ride down that Shell Road, see what's at the Troclair camp. But we do it smart, and we do it with enough backup that nobody gets any ideas about keeping us quiet the hard way." They spent the rest of the morning running the license plates Theot had memorized. All the vehicles came back registered to different names at different addresses across southern Louisiana. None of the registrations raised immediate red flags, but that in itself was suspicious. If this was a legitimate operation, you'd expect to see some pattern, some company name, something that tied the vehicles together. At noon, Theot called a meeting with his senior deputies. There were 6 of them gathered in the conference room, men and women who'd served under him long enough to understand how the parish worked. He laid out what Marcel had reported and what they'd observed that morning. "I need 2 volunteers to come with Deputy Arsenault and me tomorrow morning. We're going to drive down to that fish camp and see what's happening. This stays in this room. Nobody talks about it. Not to family, not to friends. If word gets out before we're ready, we lose any chance of seeing what's really going on out there." 4 hands went up. Theot selected 2 deputies he trusted, both of them local boys who knew how to handle themselves in the back country. The meeting broke up, and Theot returned to his office. He pulled out the old map again and studied the area around the Trosclair camp. The shell road dead-ended at the camp, which sat on a narrow piece of land between the bayou and a brackish lake. It was accessible only by that one road or by boat. In hurricane season, the whole area flooded. Even in good weather, it was isolated, the kind of place where you could operate without anyone noticing, as long as you kept the right people quiet. His phone rang. It was Celeste Stein. "Sheriff got Marcel Guidry on the line again, says it's urgent." Theot felt his pulse quicken. Put him through. The line clicked. "Sheriff." Marcel's voice was tight. "You need to know something." "About an hour after you left, a guy came by, not one of the regular drivers. He wanted to know who'd been asking about the ferry traffic. What did you tell him?" "Told him you'd been here asking routine questions. Figured there was no point lying." "Good. What did he look like?" "White guy, maybe 45, 50, thin. Had a New Orleans accent. Drove a black Silverado. He didn't threaten me or nothing, but the way he asked, it was clear he wanted to know. He say anything else? Just that he appreciated my honesty." Then he left, headed back toward the camp. Theot thanked him and hung up. So they knew the sheriff was asking questions. That changed the timeline. If they were smart, they'd shut down the operation immediately, clean out whatever was at that camp, and disappear. If they were desperate or stupid, they might try to keep running long enough to move whatever inventory they had. And if they were dangerous, they might decide that one sheriff asking questions was a problem that needed solving. Theot stood and walked to the window. Outside, the afternoon heat was building, the kind of wet heat that made the air feel like you could drink it. He'd lived his whole life in this parish, had seen it through storms and floods, through economic collapse and slow recovery. He'd watched families leave and new people arrive. He'd buried friends and married others. This place was in his blood. But there were parts of the parish that had always operated by different rules. Places where the old ways persisted, where family ties mattered more than legal authority, where certain activities were tolerated as long as they didn't draw too much attention. He'd learned early in his career that there were things a sheriff could change and things he couldn't, and knowing the difference was what kept you effective. This felt like it was crossing a line, though. Whatever was happening at that fish camp, it was big enough to require regular ferry traffic, organized enough to involve multiple vehicles and drivers, and profitable enough that someone was already checking to see who was asking questions. He picked up his phone and called Arsenault. "Change of plans. We go tonight midnight, just you and me." There was a pause on the other end. "You sure, Sheriff?" "They know I'm asking questions. If we wait until tomorrow, that camp will be empty. We go tonight, we might catch them with their guard down. What about backup? We'll have our radios. If things go wrong, we call for help. But I want to see what we're dealing with before we bring in more people." Another pause. "All right, I'll meet you at the department at 11:30. Theot spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. He checked his service weapon, made sure his flashlight had fresh batteries, reviewed the map of the area around the Trosclair camp. He thought about calling his daughter in Houston just to hear her voice, but decided against it. No point in worrying her. At 11:15 p.m., he drove back to the department. The building was mostly dark, just the night dispatcher on duty. Arsenault was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against his personal truck, a beat-up Tacoma that looked like every other truck in the parish. "We'll take yours," Theot said. "Less obvious than a patrol unit." They drove south on Highway 23, windows down, the night air thick with the smell of the marsh. The moon was 3-4 full, providing enough light to see by, but not so much that they'd be easily spotted. They turned onto the gravel road leading to the ferry just before midnight. The ferry was tied up on the far side, the shack dark. Marcel would be home in bed. They parked the truck in the same stand of willows they'd used that morning and continued on foot. The crossing was only about 60 yards wide. They could have waited for the ferry, but using it would announce their presence to anyone listening. Instead, Theot led them along the bayou bank to where he remembered seeing an old pier rogue tied up years ago. It was still there, half filled with rainwater, but serviceable enough. They bailed it out and paddled across in silence. The bayou was dark and still, the water like oil. Something splashed near the far bank, probably a gator. Theot had stopped worrying about gators decades ago. There were more dangerous things in the marsh than reptiles. They reached the far side and pulled the prog up into the vegetation. From here, it was about 3 minutes down the shell road to the Trosclair camp. They could have driven, but the sound of an engine would carry in the night silence. Walking would take longer, but it would keep them undetected. The shell road was in worse shape than Theot remembered. Years of hurricanes and neglect had left it rutted and overgrown. They walked a single file. Arsenal behind him. A moment later, he emerged with another bag, then another. Theot felt his mouth go dry. This wasn't seafood or stolen goods. The way the men were moving, the care they were taking, the organization of it all, this was something that required precision, something valuable enough to be worth the risk. A door opened in the main building, and a new figure emerged, taller than the others, moving with authority. He said something to the men loading the trucks, and they worked faster. Theot raised the small pair of binoculars he'd brought. In the generator light spilling from the buildings, he got a clear look at the man's face. White, middle-aged, with the kind of weathered look that came from years on the water. Not someone Theot recognized. The man pulled out a phone and made a call. He spoke for maybe 30 seconds, then hung up. He looked directly at the spot where Theot and Arseno were hiding. For a moment, neither man moved. It was impossible that they'd been spotted. They were too far away, too deep in shadow. But the man kept staring as if he could feel their presence. Then he said something to the others and they stopped loading. All of them stood still, listening. "Time to go," Theot whispered. They backed away slowly, keeping low, not turning their backs until they were deep enough in the vegetation to be invisible. Then they moved quickly but quietly back towards the shell road. They'd made it maybe half a mile when they heard the engine. A truck coming up behind them fast. "Off the road," Theot ordered. They plunged into the marsh grass on the bayou side. The ground was soft, threatening to suck their boots off with each step. They pushed through sawgrass that cut their arms, ducked under low cypress branches, moving away from the road. The truck passed, then stopped. They heard doors opening, voices. They came down here somewhere. Can't have gone far on foot. Spread out. Check the banks. Flashlight beams swept through the darkness. Theot and Arseno pressed themselves into a stand of marsh grass, water up to their thighs. Something brushed against Theodot's leg, long and muscular. Gator, probably. He didn't move. The flashlights came closer. One of the beams passed within 10 FT of where they hid, then moved on. The voices continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, one of the men called out. They must have crossed back over. "Come on!" The truck doors slammed and the engine started up again. It drove back toward the camp. Theot waited another 10 minutes before moving. His legs were cramping from staying still in the cold water, and he could feel something crawling up his back under his shirt. He didn't care. They'd been lucky. They made their way back to where they'd left the prog. It took them 20 minutes to find it in the dark. The crossing was harder this time. Both men exhausted and shaking from adrenaline, but they made it. On the drive back to town, Arseno finally spoke. "What now?" "Now we call the state police, and we pray that whatever's in those buildings, we can stop it before they move it all out." But Theot knew as he said it that they were already too late. By the time they could organize a proper raid, the camp would be empty. These people were professionals. They'd seen the writing on the wall the moment someone started asking questions. The only question now was whether they'd leave quietly, or whether they'd decide that loose ends needed tying up. As they pulled into the department parking lot, Theot's phone rang. It was Celeste Stein, which was odd because she wasn't on duty tonight. "Sheriff, I just got a call on my personal line. Guy said he wanted to talk to you directly. Said it was about the ferry situation." "What did he say?" "He said to tell you that the parish works best when everybody minds their own business. Said you've got a daughter in Houston, and it would be a shame if anything happened to make her worry about her daddy. Theot felt ice in his veins. Did you get a number? Called from a burner already dead. Thank you, Celeste Stein. Go back to sleep. He hung up and looked at Arsenal. The young deputy's face was pale in the dashboard light. They know who you are, Arsenault said. Yeah, what are you going to do? They were silent for a long moment, thinking about his daughter, about the parish, about the oath he'd taken, about the map in his office with all those unmarked roads and forgotten places where things happened that nobody talked about. I'm going to call the state police in the morning. Get them involved. Get the DEA if it's drugs. Get whoever we need. But after that, he paused. After that, I don't know. They sat in the parking lot as the night slowly gave way to morning. Somewhere out there in a fish camp that shouldn't exist on a road that barely appeared on maps, people were loading trucks with something valuable enough to kill for, and they just made it clear that they knew exactly who was asking questions. Theot had faced dangerous situations before. He dealt with armed suspects, domestic violence calls that turned violent, hurricanes that threatened to drown the whole parish. But this felt different. This felt like the moment when you realize that the ground you thought was solid has been hollow all along, and now it's starting to crack beneath your feet. The sun was coming up over the levee, painting the sky orange and red. It was going to be a beautiful day, clear and calm. Theot wondered how many more of those he had left. Theot didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table with a pot of coffee going cold and his service weapon within reach, staring at his phone. Every time a car passed on the street outside, he tensed. Every sound in the house made him reach for the gun. By the time dawn broke, he'd made a decision that felt both necessary and like a betrayal of everything he'd sworn to uphold. At 6 a.m. he called his daughter in Houston. She answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. Dad, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong, sweetheart. I just wanted to hear your voice. There was a pause. His daughter knew him well enough to recognize when he was lying. Dad, it's 6 a.m. What's going on? He wanted to tell her everything. Wanted to warn her that someone had threatened her, that she should be careful, that maybe she shouldn't come home for a while. But saying those things out loud would make them real in a way he wasn't ready to face. I'm working on something. It might get complicated. I need you to promise me you'll be careful for the next few weeks. Lock your doors. Pay attention to your surroundings. If anything seems off, you call me immediately. You're scaring me. I know, I'm sorry. Just promise me. I promise. Dad, are you in danger? I'm always careful. You know that. They talked for a few more minutes, the conversation awkward, and waited with things unsaid. When he hung up, Theot felt older than his 53 years. He'd spent his career trying to keep the parish safe, and now his own child was a target, because he'd asked questions about the wrong operation. At 8 a.m., he walked into the department and found Arsenault already at his desk, looking like he'd slept about as well as Theot had. The young deputy stood when he saw the sheriff approach. I've been thinking, Arsenault said quietly. Maybe we should back off this. Call in the state police like you said, but then step away. Let them handle it. They understood the impulse. Self-preservation was a reasonable instinct when someone threatened your family. But he also knew that backing away now wouldn't make the threat disappear. These people had already shown they knew who he was, where his daughter lived. He hung up and stared at the map on his wall. The red pin he'd placed at the Trosclair camp location seemed a pulse in his vision. Somewhere out there, people were making calculations about whether a parish sheriff was worth the trouble of silencing permanently, or whether a threat would be enough to keep him quiet. Celestine knocked on his doorframe. Sheriff, got a visitor for you. Says it's important. Who is it? Etienne Trosclair says he heard you've been asking about his family's fish camp. Theo felt his pulse quicken. The Trosclair family owned the property where the operation was running. If Etienne was here, it meant word had traveled fast through the parish network. Send him in. Etienne Trosclair was in his late 40s, a commercial fisherman with the weathered face and strong hands that came from decades of hard work on the water. Theot had known the family peripherally for years, the way everyone in the parish knew each other's names and faces without necessarily being close. Etienne sat across from Theo's desk, his body language defensive. I heard you were out by our old camp. That's right. You know what's happening out there? No, and I don't want to know. Etienne leaned forward. That property belonged to my father. When he died, it went to me and my brothers. We haven't used it in years. About 6 months ago, a guy approached us at the marina. Said he wanted to lease the camp for a seafood wholesaling operation. Offered us good money. Cash for a 1-year lease with an option to extend. You get a name. Called himself Marcus Bro. Gave us cash up front 3 months in advance. We signed some papers, gave him the keys, and that was it. We figured it was legitimate. People buy and sell seafood all the time out there. You ever go check on the property? Etienne shook his head. Lee says we stay away while he's operating. We get the camp back at the end of the term. No questions asked. Sheriff, we're not involved in whatever's happening out there. We just needed the money. Fishing's been bad the last few years, and that lease payment keeps us afloat. Theo studied the man across from him. Etienne looked genuinely worried, the kind of worry that came from realizing you'd made a mistake, without fully understanding what that mistake was. I need copies of those lease papers, and I need you to tell me everything you remember about this Marcus Bro. I can get you the papers. As for Bro, he was maybe 50 years old. Talked like he was from New Orleans. Drove a black Silverado. Knew the area well enough to find us at the marina, without asking for directions. The black Silverado, the same vehicle Marcel had mentioned seeing after Teo's first visit to the ferry. He ever contact you after that initial meeting? Once a month, he comes by with an envelope of cash for the next month's lease. We've learned not to ask questions. The money's good. And as long as we stay away from the camp, he's been professional about the whole thing. When's he supposed to come by next? 3 days from now. Always comes on the first Thursday of the month, right around sunset. Theo felt a plan forming. I need you to act normal when he comes. Take the money. Don't mention me or my department. Can you do that? Etienne looked uncomfortable. Sheriff, I don't want trouble. We're just trying to make a living. I understand that. But whatever's happening at your family's camp, it's bigger than a seafood operation. People have made threats against my family. That means whatever they're protecting is serious enough to kill for. I need your help to stop it before someone gets hurt. The fisherman was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped in his lap. Finally, he nodded. All right, but after this, we're done. We'll tell Bro the lease is over, and we'll stay clear of whatever comes next. Fair enough. I'll have Deputy Arsenault meet with you later to get those papers. And Etienne, if Bro or anyone else asks if you've talked to law enforcement, you tell them the truth. Tell them I came to you asking questions. There's no point in lying, and it might keep you safer if they know you're cooperating. After Etienne left, Theo called Arsenault into his office. We've got 3 days before Marcus Bro makes his monthly payment to the Trosclairs. I want to know everything about him by then. Start with the black Silverado. Run every registration in the parish for that make and model. Check with informants. See if anyone knows a Marcus Bro working in distribution or smuggling, and do it quietly. You think Bro's his real name? No, but it's what he's using in the parish, which means other people might know him by it. Over the next 2 days, a picture began to emerge. A black Chevrolet Silverado registered to a Marcus Bro at an address in Terrebonne Parish. The address turned out to be a mail forwarding service, a dead end, but Arsenault's contacts in the fishing community had heard the name. Marcus Bro was known as a middleman, someone who connected buyers with sellers for various goods that didn't always move through legal channels. Unted seafood, yes, but also other things. There were rumors of drug connections, whispers about human trafficking, stories that people told in bars late at night when the beer had been flowing. None of it was concrete. All of it felt true. On Thursday afternoon, Theot positioned himself and Arsenault in an unmarked vehicle near the marina, where the Trosclairs kept their boats. They'd been there since 4 p.m., watching the comings and goings of the fishing fleet. At 6:45 p.m., as the sun was painting the bayou orange and gold, a black Silverado pulled into the parking area. The man who emerged matched Etienne's description. Average height, thin build, with the kind of face that you'd forget 5 minutes after seeing it. He walked to where Etienne was working on his boat, spoke for maybe 2 minutes, handed over an envelope, and left. The entire transaction took less than 5 minutes. Theot let the Silverado pull out of the parking lot before following at a distance. The truck headed south on Highway 23, back toward the ferry crossing. Theot stayed well back, using the evening traffic as cover. When the Silverado turned onto the gravel road leading to the ferry, Theot stopped at the intersection. and watched through binoculars. Bro drove onto the ferry, crossed to the far side and disappeared down the Shell Road toward the Trosclair camp. 20 minutes later, he emerged again, crossed back over, and drove north toward New Orleans. He checked on the operation, Arseno said, making sure everything's running smooth. Yeah, which means they're still operating. Whatever we saw the other night didn't spook them enough to shut down. They followed the Silverado north until it merged onto Interstate 10 heading toward New Orleans. Continuing the tail into the city would be too obvious, so Thiot let him go. But they had confirmation now that Bro was real, that he was connected to the camp, and that he made regular visits to check on whatever operation was running there. That night, Thiot made another call to Detective Chauvin at the state police. I've got more information. A name, a vehicle, regular patterns of movement. We've got probable cause now for surveillance. Chauvin sighed. Aubrey, I'm going to level with you. I put in the request for resources 3 days ago like I said I would. It got kicked back. The brass wants to know why we're looking at a fish camp in Plamines Parish when we've got major drug operations in Baton Rouge and New Orleans that need attention. So we're on our own? Not entirely. I can give you some equipment, cameras and recording devices. And if you find something concrete, something that justifies a raid, I can get you back up within a few hours. But until then, you're working with what you've got. It was better than nothing, but not by much. Thiot thanked him and hung up. The message was clear. The state police weren't going to commit resources to a case built on observation and suspicion. They needed evidence, and getting that evidence meant taking risks that a smart sheriff would probably avoid. But Thiot had stopped feeling smart around the time someone threatened his daughter. The next morning, he and Arseno met with Detective Chauvin in a rest area halfway between Bellechasse and the parish seat. Chauvin handed over a duffel bag containing 2 trail cameras, a directional microphone, and several small recording devices. These aren't officially part of any investigation, Chauvin said. If you get caught with them, they're personal property. We need to get those cameras in place, Thiot said. But we can't do it in daylight. Too much chance of being seen. Another night operation, no choice. But this time we do it right. We go in after midnight, when they're likely to have minimal personnel on site. We place the cameras and the recording devices. Then we get out. No heroics, no confrontations. We're just gathering evidence. Arseno nodded, but Thiot could see the worry in his eyes. They both knew that going back to that camp was dangerous. These people had already demonstrated they were aware of surveillance and willing to make threats. If they caught Thiot and Arseno actively placing monitoring equipment, the response might be more direct than a phone call. They spent the rest of the day planning. Thiot studied maps of the area, identifying approach routes and escape paths. He thought about timing, about moon phase and tide levels. He thought about his daughter in Houston and about the oath he'd taken when he first pinned on a badge. He thought about the parish he'd sworn to protect and about the line between duty and suicide. At 11 p.m., sir, they met at a private boat launch owned by one of Arseno's relatives. The night was dark, clouds covering the moon. They loaded their gear into the aluminum boat and headed upriver, running without lights, navigating by memory and feel. The bayou at night was a different world. The darkness was absolute between the banks. The water black and silent, except for the occasional splash of a feeding fish or hunting gator. They moved slowly, letting their eyes adjust, reading the shape of the banks and the silhouettes of trees against the slightly lighter sky. The Trosclair camp appeared as a collection of darker shapes against the darkness. Generator lights glowed from inside the buildings, but dimmer than on their previous visit. One truck was parked in the clearing. They could see a figure moving past a window, but the level of activity was much lower than before. They continued past the camp again, traveling another half-mile before pulling into a small cut in the bank. They tied off the boat and continued on foot, moving through the marsh parallel to the bayou. The ground was soft and treacherous, forcing them to move slowly, testing each step. Water moccasins and gators were the least of their concerns now. It took them 40 minutes to work their way back to a position across from the camp. They were on the opposite bank, about 70 yards from the nearest building, hidden in dense palmetto and marsh grass. From here they could see the camp clearly without being exposed. Thiot set up the directional microphone, pointing it at the main building where they'd seen the most activity. He put on headphones and listened. Voices came through clearly. Men talking about loading schedules and pickup times. One voice mentioned the product and the buyers in Texas. Another discussed weather reports and whether they'd need to pause operations if a storm came through. He recorded for 20 minutes, gathering enough audio to establish that this was clearly a distribution operation of some kind. The men spoke in the coded language of people who knew better than to be specific over radios or an open conversation, but the context was clear enough. Placing the trail cameras was more difficult. They needed to be positioned where they'd capture activity at the camp without being so obvious that someone would spot them. Theot crawled through the marsh to a large cypress tree about 40 yards from the dock. He secured one camera in the crook of the tree, angling it to capture boats arriving at the dock and vehicles loading at the buildings. The second camera took longer. He wanted it positioned to capture faces, clear images of the people operating the camp. He worked his way closer, moving inches at a time through water and mud, until he reached a position near the shell road where vehicles would have to pass. He secured the camera to a tree trunk about 15 feet off the ground, camouflaged it with Spanish moss, and activated it. The whole operation took 3 hours. By the time they were back in the boat heading downriver, the eastern sky was starting to lighten. They were exhausted, covered in mud and scratched from soras, but they had equipment in place that would give them the evidence they needed. Back at the boat launch, as they were cleaning up, Arseno's phone rang. He answered, listened, and his face went pale. "That was my cousin, the one who lent us the boat. Says someone came by his place an hour ago, asking about who'd borrowed his boat tonight." Theot felt ice in his stomach. They knew we were out there. How? We were careful. We didn't make noise, didn't show lights. Doesn't matter how they knew. Theot looked at the younger deputy. "Jules, I think you should step back from this. Take some leave. Go visit family out of parish for a few days. This is getting too dangerous." Arseno shook his head. "With respect, Sheriff, I'm not leaving you to handle this alone. We started this together. We finish it together." Theot wanted to argue. Wanted to order him to safety, but he also understood the loyalty that kept Arseno here. The same sense of duty that had led Theot to keep pushing when every rational instinct told him to stop. "All right, but we go nowhere alone from here on. We watch each other's backs. And if this goes bad, if it comes down to it, we get out and we live to fight another day. There's no shame in retreat when you're outnumbered." They drove back to town as the sun rose over the marsh. Somewhere behind them, people who made their living in the shadows were making calculations about how to deal with a sheriff who wouldn't stay quiet. Somewhere in Houston, Theot's daughter was waking up for work, unaware that her safety depended on decisions being made in a parish she'd left behind. And somewhere in those trail cameras, images were being captured that would either break this case open or provide evidence for whoever came looking after Aubrey. Theot disappeared into the same bayou darkness that had swallowed so many secrets before him. He had maybe 48 hours before the camera's memory cards would be full. 48 hours to gather evidence, bring in the state police, and shut down whatever operation was running out of that fish camp. 48 hours before someone decided that the risk of letting him continue was greater than the risk of making a parish sheriff disappear. The parish had always kept its secrets well. Theot was betting his life that this time would be different. Theot spent Friday morning in his office, reviewing the audio recordings they'd captured from the directional microphone. He played them over and over, listening to the voices discuss schedules and shipments, buyers and product. The language was careful, coded, but patterns emerged. References to packages arriving from the Gulf, mentions of distribution points in Texas and Mississippi, a conversation about cleaning up after a delivery issue in LaFour Parish. What struck him most was the professionalism in those voices. These weren't street-level dealers or desperate criminals. They spoke like businessmen managing logistics, solving problems, optimizing routes. Whatever was moving through that fish camp, it was part of a larger network that extended well beyond Plaquemines Parish. Celeste Stein brought him coffee around 10 and noticed the dark circles under his eyes. "Sheriff, when's the last time you slept? I'll sleep when this is over." She set the coffee down with more force than necessary. "You're no good to anybody dead on your feet, and you're no good to your daughter if you get yourself killed because you're too tired to think straight." He knew she was right, but sleep felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. Every hour he waited was an hour these people had to move their operation, destroy evidence, or worse. Still, he forced himself to drink the coffee and eat the sandwich she brought him, recognizing that Celestine's concern came from a place of genuine care. Around noon, his phone rang. The number was blocked. "Sheriff Theot, Sheriff, we need to talk." The voice was male, calm with that New Orleans accent he'd heard before. "We'd hoped you'd be reasonable. For what it's worth, this isn't personal. It's simply business. Everything's personal when you threaten my family. Then you understand the stakes. You have until Monday morning to decide whether you want this to remain a business matter or become something more personal. After that, events will proceed according to their own logic." The line went dead. Theot sat staring at his phone. Monday morning, 2.5 days. The deadline was clear, as was the threat. Either he backed off or people would start getting hurt. He had no doubt they'd follow through. Operations this organized didn't make empty threats. He called Arseno into his office and played the recording he'd made of the conversation. The deputy's face grew darker as he listened. "They're not bluffing," Arseno said when it finished. "These people know how to make problems disappear in the marsh. We've got maybe a dozen unsolved disappearances in the last 5 years. People who went out on the water and never came back. Always assumed they were accidents or got lost in bad weather. Now I'm wondering how many of those were accidents at all. I've been thinking the same thing." They pulled out a file he'd been compiling. "I went back through records for the last 10 years. Found 17 cases of people who disappeared in the southern part of the parish. Fishermen mostly, but also a couple of environmental inspectors, a Coast Guard officer who was investigating illegal fishing, and a journalist who was writing about smuggling routes. You think they're all connected to this operation? I think when you run the kind of network we're looking at, you don't let obstacles stand in your way. And I think we're about to become obstacles if we're not careful." They spent the next hour discussing options, all of them bad. They could back off, let these people continue their operation, and hope the state police eventually took an interest. They could push forward, try to gather enough evidence in the next 2 days to force intervention and risk retaliation. Or they could try something in between, appear to back off while actually maintaining surveillance. But that required a level of deception that would be hard to sustain. "What do you want to do?" Arseno finally asked. Theot looked at the map on his wall, at the red pin marking the Troclair camp, at all the waterways and back roads that made this parish both beautiful and treacherous. He thought about his daughter, about the deputies who'd served under him, about the oath he'd taken. He thought about 17 people who'd disappeared into the marsh, and how many more might follow if nobody stopped this. "I want to check those cameras tomorrow morning, see what we've captured. If we've got faces, license plates, something concrete, then we bring it to the state police and force them to act. If we don't have enough yet, then we make a decision about how far we're willing to go. And if they're watching us, if they know we're going back to the camp, then we'll find out just how serious they are about their deadline." That evening, Theot drove home through a parish that felt different than it had a week ago. The same houses, the same churches, the same people waving from their yards, but now he saw it through different eyes. How many of these people knew about the operation at the Troclair camp? How many benefited from it directly or indirectly? How many would look the other way because that's what you did in a place where everyone knew everyone, and keeping your mouth shut was survival? He thought about calling his daughter again, but decided against it. She'd hear the stress in his voice, would ask questions he couldn't answer. Instead, he sat on his porch with the beer he barely touched and watched the sun set over the levee. The sky turned crimson and gold, reflecting off the muddy water of the canal behind his house. It was beautiful, the kind of evening that reminded him why he'd never left this place despite all its complications. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Last chance to reconsider, Sheriff. Think about your daughter." He deleted the text and finished his beer. He wasn't reconsidering anything. Saturday morning came gray and humid, the kind of weather that promised rain before noon. Theot and Arseno met at the same boat launch they'd used before, but this time they brought 2 additional deputies, men Theot trusted completely. He'd briefed them on the situation, shown them the evidence he'd gathered, and given them the option to walk away. Neither had taken it. They traveled upriver in 2 boats, staying far enough apart to avoid looking like law enforcement, but close enough to support each other if trouble started. The plan was simple: retrieve the trail camera memory cards, get back to town and review what they'd captured. No confrontation, no heroics. The morning was quiet on the water. They passed a few fishing boats, locals checking their lines or running traps. Everyone waved, the automatic greeting of people who shared these waterways. They wondered if any of them were watching. Reporting back to Bro or whoever was running the operation, they approached the area near the Trusclair camp cautiously. The first camera was in the cypress tree overlooking the dock. Arsino climbed up while Theo kept watch from the boat. The camera was undisturbed, memory card full of footage. They had 3 days of recorded activity. Boats arriving at the dock, trucks being loaded, men moving between buildings, most importantly faces. Clear images of at least a dozen different individuals. The second camera, positioned near the Shell Road, was more problematic. When they reached the location, they found it had been moved. Not removed entirely, but repositioned to face away from the camp, pointing instead into empty marsh. They found it, Arseno said quietly, but they left it in place. Why? The answer became clear a moment later, when they heard engines approaching from upriver. 2 boats moving fast, heading directly toward their position. Time to go, Theot said, his hand moving instinctively to his service weapon. They pushed their boat back into the main channel and opened the throttle. Behind them, the 2 boats accelerated, closing the distance. Theot could see 3 men in each boat, none of them in any kind of uniform, but all of them moving with purpose. The radio crackled. Their backup boat with the other 2 deputies reporting they could see the pursuit and were moving to intercept. Negative, Theot responded. Stay clear. Do not engage. We're heading for the main highway. The chase lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it felt longer. The pursuing boats were faster, gaining steadily. Theot kept the throttle wide open, navigating by instinct through channels he'd known since childhood. They burst out of the bayou system into the wider channel that ran alongside Highway 23, and suddenly they were in view of the road, of civilization, of witnesses. The pursuing boat slowed, then turned back. The message had been delivered. We know where you are. We know what you're doing, and we can reach you whenever we want. Theot's hands were shaking as he tied up at the public boat launch near Pantalache. Arseno was pale but composed, already pulling out his phone to call for backup. Belay that, Theot said. Call Detective Chauva. Tell him we've got evidence and we need the state police here today. Not Monday, not next week. Today. While Arseno made the call, Theo reviewed what they'd captured on the first camera. The footage was even better than he'd hoped. Clear images of Marcus Bro, of other men loading what appeared to be large duffel bags onto trucks, of boats arriving with cargo, timestamps, license plates. Everything they needed to establish this was an ongoing criminal operation. One image in particular caught his attention. A man emerging from the main building, middle-aged, wearing expensive casual clothes, talking on a cell phone. He carried himself with authority, and the way other men deferred to him suggested he was high in the organization. Theo took a screenshot and texted it to Chauvin with a message. Need ID on this subject. Priority, Chauvin called back 15 minutes later. Horbury, that man you sent me is Victor Coe. He's been on federal watch list for 20 years, suspected of running smuggling operations from Texas to Florida, but they've never been able to make charges stick. If he's personally at that camp, whatever you've stumbled onto is bigger than we thought. How fast can you get here? I'm in Belchus. I can have a tactical team assembled in 3 hours. But Aubrey, if Coe is involved, we need to do this. None of them knew that their sheriff was sitting in a parking lot trying to figure out how to stay alive long enough to see this case through. His phone rang again. This time it was Detective Chauvin. Aubrey, I've been making calls. The DEA has been tracking Victor Coe for years. If we can give them something solid, they'll jump on this. But they need more than surveillance footage. They need testimony, financial records, some link between the camp and actual criminal activity. The recordings, the conversations about shipments and distribution, that's not enough. It helps, but good lawyers will argue it's ambiguous. We need someone to flip, someone on the inside willing to testify about what's really moving through that camp. Theo thought about the Trosclair brothers, about Marcel at the ferry, about all the local people who'd looked the other way while this operation grew. Give me 24 hours. I'll find you a witness. He spent Saturday afternoon driving through the parish, stopping at marinas and fish camps, talking to people who'd known him for decades. Most conversations were brief and unproductive. People knew better than to talk about things that could get them hurt. but a few were more open, especially after Theot showed them the photo of Victor Coe. That's the man who's been hiring crew for boat runs. One marina owner told him, pays good money cash for people to run packages up the Gulf Coast. Most folks don't ask what's in the packages. You know anyone who's worked for him? The marina owner hesitated, then gave him a name. Eddie Fontenot. He's run maybe a dozen trips for Coe's people. But Sheriff Eddie's got kids. He won't talk if it means putting them at risk. They found Eddie Fontenot at his house in Port Sulphur, a small frame building that had been rebuilt after Katrina. Eddie was in his 30s, a commercial fisherman who'd fallen on hard times when oil spills and hurricanes decimated the local fishing industry. He answered the door with the baby in his arms and suspicion in his eyes. I'm not looking to jam you up, Theot said after introducing himself. I'm looking to stop the people who are using you and everyone else in this parish. Victor Coe and his operation. I need someone who's seen the inside of what they're doing. Someone willing to tell the truth. And in exchange for the truth, what? I get killed? My family gets threatened. In exchange for the truth, you get witness protection. Federal protection. The DEA will relocate you and your family, give you a new start somewhere safe. But I need you to be willing to testify about what you've seen, what you've transported, where it came from and where it went. Eddie looked at his baby, then back at the two more kids, my wife. They didn't ask for any of this, I know. And I'm asking you to trust me when I say the only way out is through. These people aren't going to stop. If they think you're a liability, eventually they'll make sure you're not. But if you come forward now before they know you're talking, we can protect you. They talked for another hour. Eddie described the runs he'd made, picking up packages from boats in international waters and bringing them to shore at the Trosclair camp. He detailed the organization, the layers of insulation between the people doing the work and the people giving orders. He explained the payment system, the threats made to ensure silence, the disappearances of people who'd asked too many questions. By the time Theot left, he had enough. Eddie had agreed to speak with federal agents to testify if it came to that. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to build a case that would stand up in court. They called Chauvin from his truck. So I've got your witness, Eddie Fontenot, local fisherman who's been running packages for Chemo's operation. He'll talk to the DEA. Good work. I'll have agents contact him tonight. Meanwhile, the tactical team is assembled. We're planning the raid on the Trosclair camp for tomorrow morning early, before they can move anything. I want to be there. Aubrey, that's not a good idea. You're too close to this. If something goes wrong, I'm the sheriff of this parish. It's my jurisdiction, my case. I'm going to be there. Chauvin sighed. All right, but you stay back. Let the tactical team do their job. Your role is to provide local knowledge and handle any jurisdictional issues. You're not going through the door first, understood, understood. That evening, Theot checked into a motel in Belchas. Following Chauve's advice about staying somewhere unpredictable, he called his daughter, told her he loved her, dodged her questions about why he sounded strange. After hanging up, he sat on the motel bed with his service weapon disassembled on the bedspread, cleaning each piece with the methodical care his training instructor had taught him 30 years ago. Tomorrow would be the culmination of everything that had started with a phone call from a ferry operator. Tomorrow, state police and federal agents would descend on a fish camp in his parish and either shut down a major smuggling operation or discover that Coe had been smart enough to clear out before they arrived. Tomorrow, Theot would either emerge as the sheriff who'd broken up a criminal network or as a cautionary tale about sheriffs who didn't know when to let sleeping dogs lie. He reassembled his weapon, loaded it, and set it on the nightstand. Sleep came in brief, fitful intervals, punctuated by dreams of dark water, and voices in languages he couldn't understand. Somewhere in the parish, Victor Coe and Marcus Bro were making their own preparations. Somewhere decisions were being made about whether tomorrow would end with arrests or with something messier. The alarm went off at 3 a.m. Teo, dressed in darkness, strapped on his weapon and drove south toward Plamine's parish. The staging area was a closed gas station 5 miles from the Trosclair camp. When he arrived, he found 24 law enforcement vehicles, state police tactical units, DEA agents, Coast Guard boats that would block any escape by water. Detective Chauvin briefed the assembled officers on the operation. Intelligence suggested 10 to 15 suspects at the camp, likely armed. The goal was to secure the site arrest everyone present and preserve evidence. Medical support was standing by. The DEA had already arranged for Eddie Fontenot and his family to be moved to a safe location. At 4:30 a.m., the convoy began moving south. No lights, no sirens. They stopped a mile from the camp, and the tactical teams proceeded on foot while others moved into position by water. Theot watched from a command vehicle, listening to radio traffic, tracking the team's progress. At 5:15 a.m., the teams reported they were in position. Thermal imaging showed heat signatures in 2 of the 3 buildings at the camp. Everything was ready. The assault began at 5:20 a.m., coordinated between the land and water teams. Theot heard the commands over the radio. State police search warrant. Show me your hands. Then the shooting started. The radio chatter exploded into chaos, multiple voices shouting over each other. The sharp crack of gunfire puncturing through the static, commands being issued and countermanded in the confusion of a raid going sideways. Theot sat forward in the command vehicle, every muscle tense, listening to his worst fears playing out in real time through the speakers. Shots fired. Shots fired. We have armed resistance from the main building. Team 2 is pinned down at the dock, requesting cover fire. Subject fleeing toward the water. Blackmail armed with more gunfire. This time sustained the tactical rhythm of trained shooters, laying down suppressing fire. Theot's hand went to his own weapon, instinct overriding the promise he'd made to Chauva to stay back. But he remained in the vehicle, forcing himself to let the professionals do their work, to trust the training and experience of the tactical teams. The firefight lasted maybe 3 minutes, though it felt like hours. Gradually, the radio traffic became more organized, more controlled. Officers reporting positions, confirming targets secured, calling for medical assistance. When Chauva finally gave the all-clear signal, 8 suspects. Theot emerged from the command vehicle as the sun was rising over the bayou, painting the scene in shades of gold and red that felt obscene given what had just happened. He walked down the Shell Road toward the Troclair camp, passing tactical officers maintaining perimeter security, EMTs treating the wounded suspects, evidence technicians already beginning their methodical documentation. The camp looked different in daylight after an assault. Bullet holes punctured the walls of the main building. Broken windows gaped like missing teeth. One of the trucks had been disabled by gunfire, its tires flat and steam hissing from a punctured radiator. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the organic decay smell of the marsh, creating an atmosphere that would haunt Theot's memory for years to come. Detective Chauvin met him at the entrance to the main building, his face grim but satisfied. We got them, Aubrey. 8 suspects, including 3 we've been looking for in connection with smuggling operations across the Gulf Coast. The buildings are full of evidence, enough to put these people away for decades. What about Coe and Bro? Chauvin's expression darkened. Neither one was here. We've got people looking for them, but my guess is they cleared out sometime yesterday, probably after your boat chase. They knew we were getting close. Theot felt a mixture of relief and frustration. They'd broken up the operation, taken down a significant piece of the network, but the architects had escaped. Coe and Bro were still out there, free to rebuild elsewhere to threaten other parishes, other law enforcement officers who got too curious. Can I see inside? Chauvin nodded and led him through the door. The interior of the main building had been converted into a sophisticated distribution center. Shelving units lined the walls holding duffel bags and sealed containers. A table in the center of the room held scales, packaging materials, and a laptop that evidence technicians were carefully photographing before removal. On one wall, a large map showed the Gulf Coast from Texas to Florida, with various locations marked in red. What were they moving? Theot asked. Multiple products. We found cocaine, methamphetamine, prescription opioids, and firearms. This wasn't just a drug operation. They were running a full Irvis distribution network. Boats would bring shipments up from international waters. They'd process and repackage everything here, then truck it out to buyers across the region. In a back room, they found living quarters for whoever had been manning the camp, bunks for 6 people, a kitchen area, supplies for extended stays. On another table, paperwork that would eventually help investigators trace the money flows and identify additional players in the organization. But what caught Theot's attention was a bulletin board in what appeared to be an office area. Pinned to it were photographs, dozens of them, images of law enforcement officers from multiple parishes. Some were official photos from department websites. Others appeared to be surveillance shots taken without the subject's knowledge. Theat recognized several faces, including his own. There were photos of him at his house, at the department, at the grocery store. Photos of Arsenal, photos of Detective Chauvin. They were building dossier on anyone who might pose a threat, Chuan said quietly, standing beside him. We found similar boards in the other buildings. Names, addresses, family members. They weren't just running product. They were running intelligence operations. Among the photos, Theat found one that made his blood run cold. His daughter walking across a parking lot in Houston. The photo was recent, taken within the last week based on the clothes she was wearing. Written below it in neat handwriting was her address, her workplace, her daily routine. He pulled the photo down and stared at it, feeling rage and fear competing in his chest. These people hadn't just threatened his daughter. They'd been actively surveilling her, tracking her movements, preparing detailed plans for how to reach her if they needed leverage against him. I want every piece of paper in this camp, Theat said, his voice tight. Every photo, every note, every scrap of information they collected. I want to know everyone they targeted, everyone they threatened, everyone they thought might interfere with their operation. We're already on it, Chauvin assured him. This is going to be a federal case now. The DEA, FBI, they'll all be involved. What you started here, Aubrey, it's going to reach a lot further than Plowmeans Parish. The sun was fully up now, and boats were beginning to appear on the bayou. Local fishermen who would see the law enforcement presence at the Trosclair camp and understand that something significant had happened. By evening, everyone in the parish would know. Some would be relieved. Others would be worried about what came next. A few would be calculating how this affected their own arrangements with Coe's organization. Theat spent the rest of Sunday at the camp, watching the evidence teams work, giving statements to federal agents, providing context about the parish and its waterways that helped investigators understand the scope of what they'd uncovered. The operation had been more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized. Multiple boats shifting schedules to avoid Coast Guard patrols, carefully cultivated relationships with local people who looked the other way for cash payments or subtle threats. By late afternoon, the medical examiner had pronounced the wounded suspect stable enough for transport. The unwounded prisoners were being processed, some already lawyering up and refusing to talk, others looking scared enough that investigators thought they might flip. None of them would give up Como or Bro directly, but piecing together their individual knowledge would eventually paint a picture of the larger network. As evening approached, Theat finally left the camp and drove back toward town. He was exhausted, running on coffee and adrenaline, his body aching from stress and lack of sleep. But there was one more thing he needed to do before he could rest. He stopped at Marcel Guidra's house near the ferry landing. Marcel answered the door with a weary expression that shifted to something like relief when he saw who it was. Sheriff, I heard what happened at the camp. I wanted to thank you, Marcel. If you hadn't made that first call, none of this would have happened. A lot of poison would still be flowing through this parish. Marcel stepped out onto his porch, closing the door behind him. I've been running that ferry for 30 years. I've seen a lot of things, Sheriff. Things I didn't talk about because that's not how we do things here. But this time it felt different. The way those men moved, the way they looked at people, it wasn't just business. It was something meaner. I got grandchildren, Sheriff. I didn't want them growing up in a parish where that kind of mean could operate without anyone saying nothing. They talked for a while longer, standing on the porch as the sun set over the bayou. Marcel told him about other things he'd seen over the years, small infractions and larger crimes that had passed through his ferry crossing without comment. Most of it was beyond the statute of limitations now, old history that couldn't be prosecuted, but it painted a picture of a parish that had long operated on unwritten rules about what could be ignored and what couldn't. Things might change now, Theat said. Federal agencies are going to be looking harder at everything that moves through here. Some people aren't going to like that. Maybe, but Plata was in his early 30s, with the lean build of someone who spent time on the water. His face was bruised from the arrest, and his eyes had the exhausted, frightened look of someone realizing exactly how much trouble he was in. "Oh, you wanted to talk to me," they said, taking a seat across from him. "Yeah, look, I'm not a career criminal, okay? I got into this because I needed money. My kid has medical issues, expensive issues, and commercial fishing wasn't covering it. Co's people recruited me about a year ago. Easy money, they said. Just run some packages, ask no questions. But you did ask questions. Mlett nodded. You spend enough time around these people. You see things, you hear things. I know where some of the other distribution points are. I know some of the people Chemo works with. And I know he's not going to just disappear. He's going to rebuild somewhere else, probably somewhere in this parish, because he's already got relationships here. What kind of relationships? That's what I want to trade. I give you names. You make sure the federals go easy on me. I want a deal that keeps me out of federal prison, keeps me somewhere I can still see my kid. Theo looked at Chauvin, who nodded slightly. They'd anticipated this. I can't make promises about what the federal prosecutors will do, but I can tell them you cooperated, that you provided valuable intelligence. That counts for something. Not enough. I need guarantees, Mr. Mellett. You participated in a drug and weapons smuggling operation that was moving millions of dollars worth of illegal product through this parish. You don't get to dictate terms, but if you genuinely want to help shut down the rest of Co's network, if you're willing to testify and provide evidence, then yes, prosecutors will take that into consideration. That's the best I can offer. They sat in silence for a moment, Mellett weighing his options. Finally, he sagged in his chair. All right, what do you want to know? Over the next 3 hours, Mellett laid out the structure of Co's organization. There were at least 4 other distribution points similar to the Troclair camp scattered across southern Louisiana. Each operated independently with different personnel, different routes, different security measures. Co himself moved between them, never staying in one place long enough to establish a pattern. But the key to the whole operation was the local facilitators. People who lived in the parishes, who knew the waterways and back roads, who could smooth over problems with local law enforcement, or community members who got too curious. Flett named 6 people in Plaquemines Parish alone who'd been on KO's payroll. 2 of them were commercial fishermen. 1 was a parish council member. 1 owned a marine supply store. 2 were retired law enforcement officers who provided intelligence about patrol patterns and investigation priorities. The revelation about the retired officers hit Theod hard. These were men he'd worked with, men he'd trusted. They'd sold out their oath for what Monletta estimated was maybe $5,000 a month each. Enough to supplement retirement income, but not enough to be worth betraying everything they'd once stood for. Who are they? Monletta gave the names. Theod recognized both. One had been a deputy under the previous sheriff, retired before Theod took office. The other had been a state trooper, who'd moved to the parish after leaving the force. Neither had seemed like the type to go dirty, but then again, corruption rarely announced itself. What were they providing? Information, mostly when the state police were planning operations in the area, when the Coast Guard was running enhanced patrols, stuff that helped Kyo time his shipments to avoid detection. They also helped identify potential problems, people who were asking too many questions, that kind of thing. Like me. Yeah, you were on their radar within a few days of Marcel making that first call to your department. The retired guys told Co you were the type who wouldn't let things go. That's why they started the pressure campaign early, trying to back you off before you got too deep into it. Theod felt a mixture of anger and vindication. His instinct that someone was feeding information to Co had been correct, but knowing that former law enforcement officers were the leak made it worse somehow. A betrayal not just of the job, but of the community they'd sworn to protect. By the time they finished with Millette, dawn was breaking again. Theod had been awake for over 48 hours, and his body was starting to shut down. Chauvin drove him back to his truck in the parking lot. Get some sleep, Aubrey. You've done more than anyone could have asked. The federals will take it from here. What about the locals? Flett named the people on Co's payroll will handle it quietly, professionally. But yeah, there's going to be some reckoning in this parish. Theod drove home through the early morning light. The parish looked peaceful, almost innocent. Boats heading out for a day's fishing, people getting coffee at convenience stores, children waiting for school buses, all of it normal. All of it carrying on as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The network that had operated in the shadows for years was being dismantled. People who'd thought they were safe, protected by silence and mutual complicity, were about to discover that the rules had shifted. He pulled into his driveway and sat in his truck for a long moment, too tired to move. His phone buzzed. A text from his daughter. "Dad, I saw the news. Are you okay? Call me when you can." The news had spread fast. National media was already picking up the story, calling it one of the largest drug busts in Louisiana history. The name was being mentioned along with the state police and the DEA. By tomorrow, reporters would be calling, wanting interviews, seeking the kind of attention he'd spent his career avoiding. He texted back, "I'm fine. Long couple of days, but it's over now. I'll call you later." But he knew as he typed it that it wasn't really over. Co was still out there. Bro was still out there. The buyers were still operating. They'd shut down one distribution point, arrested some of the foot soldiers, but the organization remained. It would adapt, relocate, rebuild. That's what successful criminal networks did. They evolved to survive. Theot dragged himself into the house and collapsed onto his couch without bothering to remove his boots. Sleep came instantly, deep and dreamless, the kind of exhausted unconsciousness that his body demanded after days of running on empty. He woke in the early afternoon to his phone ringing. Arseno's voice was excited. "Sheriff, turn on the news. They got him." They got Como. Theot fumbled for the remote and turned on the television. The local news was showing footage of a major arrest at a hotel in Baton Rouge. Victor Co, looking older and smaller than he had in the surveillance photos, was being led out in handcuffs, surrounded by federal agents. The crawl at the bottom of the screen detailed charges: drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, money laundering, conspiracy organized crime. The reporter was explaining how the arrest had been the culmination of a multi-agency investigation that had accelerated over the past 48 hours. Following the raid in Plumins Parish, agents had traced phone records and financial transactions that led them to Co's location. He'd been planning to flee the country, but hadn't moved fast enough. "What about Bro?" they asked. "Still looking for him. But with Co in custody and talking to avoid federal death penalty charges, they'll find him. It's just a matter of time." After hanging up, Theot sat watching the news coverage, feeling something like closure beginning to form. It wasn't complete. It wouldn't be complete until every piece of the network was dismantled, until every corrupt official was identified, until the parish could be confident that the poison had been fully extracted. But this was a start, a major start. Over the next week, the aftermath played out in stages. The federal prosecutors brought charges against 16 individuals connected to KO's organization. The two retired law enforcement officers Mallet had. His trial would eventually reveal the full scope of the intelligence operation he'd run, identifying law enforcement officers and community members who might pose threats to the smuggling network. For Theot, life slowly returned to something resembling normal, though normal now carried different weight. He testified before federal grand juries, gave interviews to internal affairs investigators, worked with prosecutors preparing cases. The department implemented new security protocols, new communication procedures, designed to prevent the kind of information leaks that had fed Como's operation. The parish itself seemed to exhale, a collective release of tension that people hadn't even realized they'd been holding. Marina owners reported that fishermen were more willing to talk about suspicious activities. Ferry operators called in concerns without worrying about retaliation. The code of silence that had protected criminal operations for so long was breaking down, replaced by something closer to actual community policing. But there were costs. Families of the arrested men faced social ostracism and economic hardship. Some moved away, unable to bear the weight of their relatives' crimes. Others dug in, maintaining their loved ones' innocence despite overwhelming evidence. The parish divided along old lines and new ones, people taking sides, casting blame, trying to understand how so much had happened without more people noticing. 3 months after the raid on the Drosclair camp, Theo attended a community meeting at the Point Allahash Civic Center. The room was packed, standing room only, people who wanted to hear directly from their sheriff about what had happened and what came next. He stood at the front of the room, feeling the weight of their attention, their expectations, their fear and hope mixed together. He thought about everything he'd learned over the past months about the complexity of a community that could harbor both genuine goodness and profound corruption. Often in the same families, sometimes in the same people. I know there are questions, he began. Questions about how this could have happened here, in a parish where everyone knows everyone. Questions about who knew what and when. Questions about trust and betrayal and how we move forward. He paused, looking out at familiar faces. I don't have all the answers. What I can tell you is that for years, dangerous people operated in our parish because they understood something about us. They understood that we value loyalty, that we protect our own, that we don't like outsiders telling us what to do. They used those values against us, turned our strengths into weaknesses. Someone in the crowd called out, "Are we safe now? Is it really over?" The specific operation we shut down is over. Victor Coe and his network are facing justice, but I won't lie to you and say that this can't happen again. As long as there's money to be made in illegal activity, there will be people looking for places to operate. Our parish, with its waterways and isolation, will always be attractive to that kind of operation. So what do we do? Another voice asked. We do what we should have been doing all along. We talk, we report. We refuse to let silence become complicity. I know that goes against tradition, against the way things have always been done. But the old way created spaces where poison could grow. If we want to protect this parish, if we want to protect our children and grandchildren, we have to be willing to be uncomfortable sometimes. We have to be willing to say something when we see something wrong, even if it means going against family or friends. The meeting lasted 2 hours. People asking questions, voicing concerns, sharing stories about what they'd seen or suspected, but never reported. By the end, Thayat felt exhausted but hopeful. Change was possible. Even in a place as set in its ways as Plamins's parish, 6 months after the raid, on a quiet afternoon in late fall, Thayat sat in his office reviewing reports when Celeste Stein buzzed him. "Sheriff, you have a visitor. Says it's personal." The man who walked through his door was in his 70s, weathered and stooped. But Thayat recognized him immediately. Leon Trosclair, the patriarch of the family whose fish camp had housed Coe's operation. "Mr. Trosclair, please sit down." The old man settled into the chair across from Thayat's desk, his hands trembling slightly. "Sheriff, I wanted to come see you before I die. Doctor says I've got maybe 6 months cancer." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Yeah, well, we all die sometime. Before I go, I needed to tell you something about that camp. My son Etienne, he told you the truth about leasing it to that bro fella. But what he didn't know, what none of my children knew, is that I'd been approached before years ago, must have been 15 years now. Different people, but the same kind of offer. Money to use the camp, no questions asked." Thayat leaned forward. "What did you tell them?" "I told them no. I was still strong then, still active in the community. I had grandchildren I wanted to be able to look in the eye. So I said no, and I thought that was the end of it." Leon paused. His breathing labored. "But after I got sick, after I had to step back from managing the property, I think maybe they approached Etienne without me knowing. Or maybe he found them. Money was tight for the boys, and they knew the camp was just sitting there unused. Why are you telling me this now? Because I want you to know that my sons aren't bad men. They made a mistake, a bad one. But they were trying to take care of their families, the only way they knew how. In this parish, we've always done what we had to do to survive. Sometimes that meant bending rules, looking the other way, making accommodations with people we shouldn't have accommodated." Leon looked out the window at the bayou beyond. "My grandfather built that camp in 1947. He worked those waters for 50 years, raised his children on what he could catch and trap. My father kept it going and I did the same. We were never rich, but we were honest. We didn't need much beyond what the land and water provided. But that world is gone now. The fishing's not what it was. The storms keep getting worse. Young people leave because there's no future here. And desperate people, they make desperate choices. I don't excuse what happened, Sheriff. I'm just saying I understand it." They sat in silence for a moment, the old man's words hanging in the air between them. Finally, Thayat spoke. "Mr. Trosclair, your sons cooperated with the investigation. They're not facing charges. What happened at that camp wasn't their fault." "Not really. They were victims too in their own way, maybe. But the camp's gone now. We had to tear it down. Part of the settlement with the federal government. 3 generations of family history erased like it never existed. Maybe that's fitting. Maybe it's time for old things to die so new things can grow." Leon stood slowly, painfully. "Take care of this parish, Sheriff. It's got problems. Always has. But it's worth saving. The people here, even the ones who make mistakes, they're worth saving. After he left, Theot sat alone in his office, thinking about everything the old man had said, about desperation and survival, about the erosion of old ways of life, and the desperate measures people took to hold on to what was slipping away, about how easy it was to judge from the outside, and how much harder it was to understand from within. The sun was setting over the bayou when he finally left the office. He drove south along Highway 23, past the ferry crossing where Marcel still operated his crossing, past the turnoff to where the Trosclair camp had once stood, past all the markers of a case that had changed his life and his parish. His phone rang, his daughter's voice bright and happy. "Hey, Dad, I'm coming home for Thanksgiving. Thought I'd stay a few extra days. When that happened, Theot would be ready. Or whoever wore the sheriff's badge would be ready, because they'd learned something important through all of this. They'd learned that silence wasn't strength, that loyalty could be twisted into complicity, and that protecting a community sometimes meant being willing to expose its darkest secrets to the light. The bayou stretched out on either side of the highway, dark water reflecting the last light of day. Somewhere in that vastness, other secrets still hid. Other operations ran their courses. Other people made calculations about profit and risk, about who could be threatened and who could be bought. But tonight, at least, Theod could drive home knowing he'd done what he'd sworn to do. He'd protected his parish as best he could. He'd stood up when it would have been easier to look away. He'd risked everything, because the alternative was accepting that some places were too broken to save. The alternative was surrender, and Aubrey Theot had never been good at knowing when to quit. He pulled into his driveway as full darkness fell. Inside his house, the lights were off, but it didn't feel threatening anymore. It just felt like home. He checked the locks anyway, old habits dying hard. But the fear that had driven him for months had finally begun to fade. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were still investigations ongoing, still testimony to give, still a parish to protect. But tonight he could rest. He'd earned that much. The bayou kept its secrets, but not all of them. Some had been dragged into the light, exposed, destroyed. That had to count for something. That had to mean something. It meant that even in a place where silence had ruled for generations, one sheriff asking the right questions at the right time could make a difference. It meant that corruption, no matter how deeply rooted, could be pulled out if you were willing to get your hands dirty doing it. It meant that sometimes, against all odds and all expectations, the good guys could win. Theot went inside, locked the door behind him, and didn't look back at the darkness. Music Sheriff Corbett Boudreaux stood on the dock at Bayou Douarge, watching the shrimp boats return through the early morning fog. The mist rolled in thick off the Gulf, turning the vessels into ghost shapes that materialized slowly as they approached the marina. He'd been coming to this dock since he was a boy. Back when his grandfather still ran a boat. Back when the shrimping industry was something you could build a life around. Now in the fall of 2019, the boats coming in looked tired, their paint fading, their crews older and fewer than they used to be. Chief Deputy Vidal Fontenot stood beside him, sipping coffee from a thermos. Vidal had worked under Corbett for the past 9 years, a steady presence who understood the rhythms of Terrebonne Parish as well as anyone. They were here because of a phone call that had come in 3 days ago, a call that should have been routine, but felt wrong in ways Corbett couldn't quite articulate. The boat they were looking for was the Miss Evangeline, a 42FT trawler owned and operated by Raymond Malong. Raymond had been reported overdue by his wife on Monday evening. He'd left port Saturday morning for a 3-day run to the offshore grounds, should have been back by Sunday night at the latest. When he hadn't returned by Monday afternoon, his wife had called the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard had called Corbett. Standard procedure for an overdue vessel. The Coast Guard had conducted aerial searches, checked the usual fishing grounds, put out alerts to other vessels in the area. Nothing. No distress calls, no debris, no sign of the Miss Evangeline or her captain. After 48 hours, the case had been handed over to the Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's Department as a missing person investigation. But something about it bothered Corbett. Raymond Malison was 58 years old, had been working these waters for 40 years. He knew every sandbar and channel, every reef and drop-off. He wasn't the type to get lost or make rookie mistakes. His boat was well maintained, equipped with modern GPS and communication equipment. For him to simply vanish without any distress signal didn't make sense. The fog began to lift as the sun climbed higher, revealing the full scope of the marina. Dozens of boats tied up at their slips, nets hanging to dry. The smell of diesel fuel and salt water and fish guts, creating an atmosphere that was home to anyone who'd grown up on these bayou. Corbett scanned the boats, looking for anyone who might have information about Raymond's last trip. He spotted a familiar figure working on deck of a boat 3 slips down, Gerard Robichaud, another veteran shrimper who often worked the same grounds as Raymond. Corbett walked over, Vidal following behind. "Gerard, you got a minute?" The older man looked up, wiping his hands on a rag that had probably been white once, but was now permanently stained with engine grease and fish blood. "Sheriff, I figured you'd come around asking about Raymond. You heard he's missing?" "Whole parish heard. Coast Guard been asking questions since Monday." Gerard climbed up from the engine compartment, his movements careful and deliberate. "I was out there same time as Raymond. Saw his boat Saturday afternoon, maybe 2 hogs. He was working the grounds about 15 Mary southeast of here. He say anything to you? Mention any problems?" "Not problems exactly." Gerard paused, seeming to weigh his words. "But he was working closer to the platforms than usual. You know the old Gulf oil rig out there? The one they decommissioned about 5 years back?" Corbett nodded. The Gulf was full of abandoned platforms, relics of boom times that had gone bust. Most were being removed slowly, weather and budgets permitting, but some still stood as rusting monuments to an industry that had defined the region for decades. Raymond was working right up against that platform. Real close, closer than most of us go. Those old structures, they can tear up your nets if you're not careful. I radioed him, asked what he was doing. He said he'd found a good pocket of shrimp there. Said it was worth the risk. That seemed normal to you? Gerard shrugged. Raymond's been having tough times, same as most of us. Shrimp prices are down. Fuel costs are up. Insurance is killing us. If he found a good spot, I don't blame him for working it. But still, something about the way he said it, like he was too eager, like maybe he was finding more than just shrimp out there. The implication hung in the air between them. The Gulf was used for all kinds of traffic, not all of it legal. Drugs moved through these waters regularly, dropped by boats from Mexico or Central America, picked up by local vessels that could navigate the shallow bayous and backwaters where Coast Guard cutters couldn't follow. Every few years, some fisherman would find a floating package and face the temptation of easy money versus doing the right thing. You think Raymond got involved in something like that? I'm not saying anything specific, Sheriff, just that a man gets desperate enough, he might make choices he wouldn't normally make. And Raymond, his wife's been sick, medical bills piling up. Their daughter's in college. Money's tight for them, tighter than most. Corbett thanked Gerard and walked back toward his patrol unit with Vidal. The morning was warming up. The fog almost completely burned off now, revealing a clear blue sky that mocked the darkness of what they might be dealing with. "What do you think?" Vidal asked as they climbed into the vehicle. "I think we need to talk to Coroner Lucille Abert about what happens when boats disappear in the Gulf. And I think we need to find out exactly what Raymond Melanson was doing out by that old platform." They drove north toward Humor, the parish seat where the coroner's office was located. Lucille Haber had been the parish coroner for 12 years, a sharp woman in her 50s who'd seen every kind of death the Bayou country could produce. She'd worked with Corbett on dozens of cases, and he trusted her judgment more than almost anyone else in the department. Her office was in a low-slung building near the courthouse, shared space with the medical examiner and various county health services. Lucille was at her desk when they arrived, reviewing what looked like autopsy reports. She glanced up as they entered. "Corbett Vidal, I assume this is about the missing shrimper." "It is? I need your expertise on something. When a boat goes missing in the Gulf, what are the..." "That's rare, but it happens. Disputes over fishing grounds, drug-related violence, insurance fraud. I've seen a few cases over the years where a boat disappearance was eventually determined to be homicide. But those are tough to prove without a body or physical evidence. If you were looking at Raymond Melanson's disappearance, what would make you suspicious? I'd want to know his financial situation. Was he insured? How much? Who's the beneficiary? I'd want to know about any conflicts he might have had with other shrimpers or with people outside the fishing community. And I'd want to know if anyone saw anything unusual in the days before he disappeared." Corbett pulled out his notebook. His wife reported him missing. They've got financial problems, medical bills. His boat was insured. I'll need to check how much. As for conflicts, that's what we're trying to determine. There's something else you should know, Lucille said, leaning forward. This isn't the first boat to go missing in that area. About 3 years ago, another shrimper named Antoine Cherami disappeared working those same grounds. His boat was found drifting with nobody on board. No signs of struggle, no blood, nothing to indicate what happened to him. Coast Guard ruled it accidental death, assumed he fell overboard. I remember that case, Vidal said quietly. Antoine's family never accepted that explanation. They said he was too experienced to just fall off his own boat. Right, and 6 years before that, another boat went missing in the same general area. That one was never found at all. The captain was a guy named Louis Tobido. He was also working near those old platforms. Corbett felt something cold settle in his stomach. 3 disappearances in the same area over 9 years, all experienced shrimpers who knew these waters. That was beyond coincidence. Why didn't anyone connect these cases before? Because they were spread out over years, handled by different investigating officers, ruled differently by different agencies. The Coast Guard handles the initial search and rescue. Your department handles the missing person investigation. Insurance companies do their own investigations. Unless someone sits down and looks at all the cases together, the pattern doesn't emerge. But you noticed, I keep records of every death and disappearance in this parish. It's my job to notice patterns. I've been meaning to bring this to your attention, but honestly, without new evidence, there wasn't much to investigate. Now with Raymond missing in the same area, I think it's time we looked at this more seriously. Corbett stood, his mind already working through the implications. I need you to pull all the files on those previous disappearances. Everything you have, everything the Coast Guard has, everything the insurance companies investigated. I want to see if there's something we missed. Back in the patrol unit, driving south toward the coast again, Corbett was quiet. Vidal knew him well enough not to interrupt his thinking. Finally, Corbett spoke. 3 boats in 9 years, same area, all experienced captains. What are the chances? That's just bad luck. Not good, Vidal replied. But what's the alternative? Someone's targeting shrimpers. Why? That's what we need to figure out. And we need to do it before Raymond Melancon's wife has to bury an empty casket. They spent the rest of the afternoon interviewing other shrimpers who'd been working the Gulf that weekend. Most had seen Raymond's boat, but none reported anything unusual. The consensus was that he'd been working a good spot near the old platform, that he'd seemed focused on his work, that nothing had appeared wrong. But underneath the statements, Corbett sensed something else. A reluctance to say too much, a carefulness in how people chose their words. The fishing community was tight-knit, bound by shared hardship and mutual dependence. They protected their own, kept their secrets, didn't talk to outsiders unless absolutely necessary. And despite wearing a sheriff's badge, despite having grown up in this parish, Corbett was still outside that inner circle. As evening approached and they prepared to head back to the office, Corbett's phone rang. It was the Coast Guard station in Huma. Sheriff Budrow, this is Lieutenant Commander Hayes. We've got a development on the Melanchon case. A fishing vessel reported finding debris about 20 meters south of the last known position. We're sending a boat to investigate, but I thought you'd want to know. What kind of debris? They couldn't get close enough to identify it clearly, but it appeared to be part of a boat hull, white with blue trim, which matches the description of the Miss Evangeline. Corbett thanked him and hung up. He looked at Vidal. They found debris. We need to get out there. By the time they reached the Coast Guard station, it was dark. A 45 FT response boat was being prepared for departure. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, a career Coast Guard officer with weathered features and tired eyes, briefed them on the situation. The debris field is in about 60 FT of water. We'll reach it in approximately 90 minutes. I've got divers standing by if we need to search below the surface. Sheriff, I have to tell you, finding debris this far from the last known position is unusual. The current and wind don't support the boat drifting that distance in 3 days. What does that mean? It could mean the boat was moving under power after the last reported sighting. Or it could mean someone moved it deliberately. They boarded the response boat and headed out into the Gulf. The water was calm, a light chop that barely moved the vessel as it cut through the darkness. Corbett stood at the rail, watching the lights of the coast recede behind them. Out here, the Gulf felt vast and indifferent, a force that took what it wanted and gave nothing back. They reached the coordinates just after 10 p.m. The debris field was illuminated by the boat's powerful searchlights, pieces of white fiberglass floating on the dark water. The divers went down while Corbett and Vidal watched from the deck. 20 minutes later, the divers surfaced. Their report was grim. The debris came from a boat that had broken apart, not from normal structural failure, but from what appeared to be a deliberate scuttling. Holes had been cut in the hull below the waterline, allowing water to flood the engine compartment and sink the vessel quickly. "Someone sank Raymond's boat on purpose," Vidal said quietly. "Yeah, question is, did they sink it with Raymond still on board, or did they sink it after taking him somewhere else?" Lieutenant Commander Hayes ordered the debris collected as evidence. They'd search the area more thoroughly at first light, see if they could locate the main wreckage, and determine if there was a body inside. On the ride back to shore, Corbett stood alone at the bow thinking about Raymond Mellison and the 2 other shrimpers who'd disappeared in this same area. 3 men, 3 boats all working the same grounds near an abandoned oil platform, all vanishing under circumstances that looked like accidents but felt like something darker. Someone was targeting these shrimpers. The question was why and whether Raymond Mellison was already dead or if there was still time to find him alive. Corbett didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table with the files Lucille had compiled spread across the surface. Like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite assemble. 3 disappearances, 9 years, same location. Raymond Mellison, Antoine Cherami, Louis Thibideau. 3 men with families, with mortgages, with lives that had been swallowed by the Gulf and recorded as accidents or unexplained losses. The files were thin, frustratingly so. Coast Guard reports that documented search efforts, but drew few conclusions. Insurance investigations that focused on policy details rather than circumstances. Death certificates that listed presumed drowned or lost at sea without much supporting evidence. No one had looked deep enough to see the pattern, because no one had been looking for a pattern. But Corbett saw it now, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. 3 experienced shrimpers working the same grounds, all disappearing without explanation. All their boats either vanishing entirely or being found in suspicious circumstances. Antoine's boat had been discovered drifting. Engine off, no one aboard. Louis's boat had never been found at all. Now Raymond's had been deliberately sunk with holes cut below the waterline. Someone was making these disappearances look like accidents. Someone had been getting away with it for nearly a decade. His phone buzzed at 5:30 a.m. Lieutenant Commander Hayes from the Coast Guard. "Sheriff, we've got divers going down at first light. Thought you'd want to be there when we search the main wreckage." Corbett was already reaching for his jacket. "I'll meet you at the dock in 20 minutes. The sun was just breaking over the bayou when they headed back out into the Gulf. Vidal had beaten him to the dock, looking as tired as Corbett felt. Neither man had slept much. They rowed the Coast Guard boat in silence, coffee in hand, watching the coast recede behind them. The dive site was marked by buoys the Coast Guard had placed the night before. The water was clearer in the morning light, that peculiar blue-green color of the Gulf in shallow areas. 60 feet wasn't deep by ocean standards, but it was deep enough to hide secrets. The divers went down while Corbett waited topside. The minutes stretched. He watched the surface, watching the bubbles rise, imagining what they were seeing down there in the murky water. A sunken boat, its hull broken, its cabin flooded, possibly containing the body of a man who'd only been trying to make a living from the sea. When the divers surfaced, their news was both better and worse than expected. The main wreckage was intact enough to confirm it was the Miss Evangeline. Raymond Mellanson's name was still visible on the stern. The damage was extensive. Multiple holes deliberately cut or punched through the hull, designed to sink the boat quickly. But there was no body inside. The cabin was empty. The deck was empty. Raymond Mellanson wasn't on his boat when it went down. So either he abandoned ship before it sank, Vidal said, or someone took him off before they scuttled it. Or he's the one who scuttled it. Lieutenant Commander Hayes added insurance fraud. Make it look like an accident. Collect the money. Start over somewhere else. Corbett had considered that possibility. Raymond's financial troubles, his wife's medical bills, the pressure of a failing industry. A man could get desperate enough to fake his own death. But something about it didn't fit. Raymond had a daughter in college, grandchildren he doted on. He wasn't the type to disappear and leave them wondering for the rest of their lives whether he was alive or dead. What about the other two? Corbett asked Hayes, Antoine Cherami and Louis Thibideau. Did anyone ever investigate the possibility they faked their deaths? Hayes pulled out a tablet and scrolled through files. Jeremy's boat was found with the engine running, all his gear still on board. If he was faking his death, why leave the boat running? And Thibideau's boat was never found at all, which makes it impossible to determine what happened. Neither case showed the kind of planning you'd expect from insurance fraud. They collected more debris, photographed the wreck site, and headed back to shore. By the time they docked, it was nearly noon. Corbett's next stop was the Melanson house, a task he'd been dreading since the case began. Raymond's wife, Marie, lived in a small frame house in Duloc, one of the shrimping communities that dotted the bayous south of Houma. The house was neat, but aging, its paint fading from years of salt air and sun. A fishing net hung on the porch wall as decoration, and the wooden sign beside the door read on Family Est 1982. Marie answered on the second knock. She was in her mid-50s with grey streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that had cried themselves dry over the past few days. She led Corbett and Vidal to the living room, where family photos covered every available surface. Raymond on his boat, Raymond with his daughter, Raymond holding grandchildren, a life documented in images that might now be all that remained. Mrs. Malassa, I need to ask you some difficult questions about Raymond's business and finances. I already told the Coast Guard everything I know. I understand, but this is a different kind of investigation now. We found Raymond's boat. It was deliberately sunk. Marie's face went pale deliberately. You mean someone killed him? We don't know that yet. We haven't found Raymond, which could mean several things, but we need to understand what he was involved in, who he might have had conflicts with. She sat heavily in an armchair that looked like it had been Raymond's favorite, judging by the wear pattern. Raymond didn't have conflicts with people. He got along with everyone. All he wanted was to work his boat and take care of his family. What about his finances? I know you've had medical expenses. Marie's expression hardened slightly. Yes, I've been sick. Cancer 3 years now. The treatments are expensive, even with insurance. Raymond worked extra trips, took on debt, did everything he could to keep up with the bills. But we weren't desperate enough to do anything illegal, if that's what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Mrs. Malison. I'm trying to understand what Raymond's situation was, what pressures he might have been under. The pressure was the same as every other shrimper in this parish. Prices are down, costs are up, and the big companies are taking more of the catch every year. The independents like Raymond, we're being squeezed out, but that doesn't mean we turn to crime. Vidal spoke up gently. Did Raymond ever mention finding anything unusual while fishing? Packages floating in the water, anything like that? No. And before you ask, no, he wasn't running drugs or anything else illegal. I know what people think about shrimpers, that we're all one bad season away from becoming criminals. But Raymond was honest. That's why we're poor. After they left, Corbett sat in the patrol unit for a long moment. Marie Melanson believed her husband was honest, and maybe he was. But honest men sometimes found themselves in situations where honesty wasn't enough to save them. What now? Vidal asked. Now we talk to the insurance company, find out what Raymond's boat was insured for, and who else might have an interest in it being at the bottom of the Gulf. The insurance agent, a man named Paul Deuce, who worked out of an office in Houma, was more forthcoming than Corbett had expected. Raymond's boat had been insured for $120,000, a standard policy for a vessel that age and condition. Marie Melanson was the beneficiary. The policy had been active for 15 years with no previous claims. Has Mrs. Melanson filed a claim? Corbett asked. Not yet. She has to wait for an official death certificate, which usually takes a while in missing person cases. But based on what you've told me about the boat being deliberately sunk, I'm not sure we'll be paying out at all. Why not? Because if Raymond scuttled his own boat, that's fraud. And if someone else sank it as part of a crime, then his death would be homicide, which triggers different policy provisions. Either way, we're going to investigate thoroughly before paying anything. What about the other two, Jeremy and Thibodeau? Deuce pulled up files on his computer. Jeremy's policy paid out about 18 months after his disappearance, $95,000 to his widow. Thibodeau's policy paid out after 7 years, when he was declared legally dead. That was $110,000 to his ex-wife. Both policies paid without dispute. Jeremy's did. Theo's took longer because there was no boat wreckage, nothing to confirm what happened. But eventually, the company decided there wasn't enough evidence of fraud to justify denying the claim. After leaving the insurance office, Corbett and Vidal drove down to Dulac again, this time to find Jeremy's widow. She still lived in the area, working at a seafood processing plant to make ends meet. Her name was Diane, and she agreed to talk to them. She lit a cigarette and listened as Corbett explained why they were asking about Antoine 3 years after his death. You think what happened to Raymond is connected to what happened to Antoine? I think it's possible. Can you tell me about the days before Antoine disappeared? Did he mention anything unusual? Anyone giving him trouble? Diane took a long drag on her cigarette. Antoine was worried about something in the weeks before he vanished. He wouldn't tell me what. Said he didn't want me involved, but I could see it in his face. The way he'd come home and just sit staring at nothing. Something was eating at him. Did he mention any conflicts with other shrimpers? No, nothing like that. If anything, he was spending more time with other captains than usual, having meetings, making phone calls. I thought maybe they were organizing, trying to negotiate better prices with the processors, but he was secretive about it, wouldn't give me details. What happened the day he disappeared? He went out on a routine trip, said he'd be back in 2 days. When the Coast Guard found his boat drifting 3 days later, they said it looked like he just stepped off the deck and vanished. Engine running, coffee still warm in his thermos. They said maybe he fell overboard, but Antoine was too careful for that. He'd been working boats since he was 14. The insurance paid out eventually. Yeah, $95,000. It kept me and the kids afloat for a while, but it's mostly gone now. Medical bills, regular bills. You know how it goes. Did you ever suspect it wasn't an accident? Diane stubbed out her cigarette. Sheriff, I've suspected a lot of things over the past 3 years, but suspecting and proving are different animals. The Coast Guard said accident. The insurance company investigated and paid. Everyone moved on except me and my kids, and we didn't have any way to fight it. So yeah, I suspected. I still suspect, but what am I supposed to do about it? They talked for a few more minutes, but Diane had nothing more concrete to offer. After she returned to work, Corbett and Vidal sat in the patrol unit, trying to piece together what they knew. 2 widows who got insurance money, Vidal said. If this is about insurance fraud, why sink Raymond's boat in a way that makes the fraud obvious? Maybe whoever's doing this got sloppy. Or maybe Raymond's case is different somehow. Corbett's phone rang. It was Coroner Hebert. Corbett, I've been going through the old files more carefully. There's something you need to see. Can you come to my office? They drove back to Homer, the afternoon sun beating down on the highway. When they arrived, Lucille had several files spread across her desk, documents marked with colored tabs. I've been comparing the 3 cases in detail, she said. And I found something interesting. All 3 men had their life insurance policies increased within 6 months of their disappearances. Raymond increased his from $80,000 to $120,000. Antoine went from $70,000 to $95,000. Luis increased his from $85,000 to $110,000. Corbett felt his pulse quicken. That's not coincidence. No, it's not. And here's what else I found. All 3 policy increases were suggested by the same insurance agent, a man named Bernard Dupuy, who works out of the same office as Paul Doucet. We need to talk to Bernard Dupuy, Vidal said. You can't, Lucille replied. He died 2 years ago, heart attack. According to the death certificate I signed, he was 63 years old, overweight, smoker. Nothing suspicious about the death itself, but the timing, Corbett said slowly. If he was involved in insurance fraud, if he was convincing these shrimpers to increase their policies and then somehow arranging their deaths, his own death could have been convenient for someone, Or it could have been natural, Lucille cautioned. Sometimes a heart attack is just a heart attack, but yes, the timing is interesting. Corbett stood and paced the small office. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was incomplete. 3 shrimpers, all with increased life insurance policies arranged by the same agent, who then died before anyone connected the cases. All 3 disappearing in the same area of the Gulf, near an abandoned oil platform. All their boats either vanishing or being found in the circumstances that suggested foul play disguised as accidents. What was special about that platform? Corbett asked. Why that location specifically? I don't know, Lucille said, but I think you need to find out. By the time Corbett and Vidal left the coroner's office, evening was approaching. They drove south toward the coast again, toward the marina at Bayou Duarge. Corbett wanted to talk to Gerard Robichaud again, wanted to understand more about the area where the disappearances had occurred. They found Gerard closing up his boat for the night. He looked surprised to see them back so soon. Sheriff, you find Raymond. Not yet, but we found his boat. Someone sank it deliberately. Gerard, I need you to tell me everything you know about that old Gulf oil platform where Raymond was fishing. Gerard glanced around the marina, checking to see who might overhear. Let's talk on my boat. They followed him onto the deck of his trawler, and Gerard closed the cabin door behind them. The space was cramped but private, smelling of diesel and old coffee. That platform, Gerard began speaking quietly. It's been a problem for years. After Gulf Oil decommissioned it, they were supposed to remove it completely, but the company went bankrupt before the removal could happen, and the platform just sat there. Officially, it's off limits. Coast Guard says no vessel should approach within 500 Waidigi, but people fish near it anyway. Of course, the structure attracts fish, which means it attracts shrimp. Good fishing around old platforms. Always has been. Most of us work the area carefully, stay legal, don't cause problems. But some guys, they get closer. They go right up to the structure. Why would they do that? Gerard was quiet for a moment. You ever hear about the drops, Sheriff? What drops? Drug runners use the platform. Sometimes they secure packages to the structure underwater below, where anyone can see from the surface. Then local boats come by and retrieve them. Quick pickup, minimal risk. Coast Guard can't monitor every abandoned platform in the Gulf. Corbett felt the last piece of the puzzle clicking into place. You think that's what Raymond was doing and Antoine and Louis before him? I'm not saying that specifically. What I'm saying is that platform area has a reputation. Everyone knows about it, but nobody talks about it directly. You work too close to that platform. You're either stupid or you're involved in something, and you think all 3 of them were involved. I think they were desperate men who made bad choices. I think someone offered them money to pick up packages when they were out fishing anyway. Easy money, or so they thought. But whatever they got involved in, it got them killed. After leaving Gerard's boat, Corbett stood on the dock watching the sunset over the bayou. The water reflected the orange and red sky, beautiful and indifferent to the human dramas playing out on its surface. We need to search that platform, he said to Vidal. See if there's any evidence of what was happening there. That's a job for the Coast Guard. We don't have the equipment or authority to board an offshore structure. Then we get the Coast Guards involved, and the DEA if this is drug-related. We do this right with proper resources. But even as he said it, Corbett knew that investigating the platform would take time, permits, coordination between agencies, probably weeks of planning. And in that time, whoever was behind these deaths would have plenty of opportunity to clean up any evidence or disappear entirely. He thought about Raymond Mellis, about whether the man was still alive somewhere or already dead. He thought about Marie Melas waiting at home for news that would probably only bring more pain. He thought about the 2 widows who'd already lost their husbands to this same conspiracy, and about how the system had failed them all by treating each disappearance as an isolated incident rather than pieces of a larger pattern. Someone had been killing shrimpers for insurance money or to cover up drug operations or both. They'd been getting away with it for years because no one had looked closely enough to see the connections. But Corbett saw them now, and he wasn't going to let this continue. Call Lieutenant Commander Hayes, he told Vidal. Tell him we need to meet tomorrow morning. Tell him we're going officially week minimum to coordinate resources and get proper authorization. Unofficially, I can have a boat there this afternoon with boarding equipment. But, Sheriff, if we find evidence of criminal activity, Anything we recover without proper warrants might not be admissible in court. Corbett weighed the options. Playing by the rules meant delay, and delay meant whoever was behind this would have time to cover their tracks. But rushing in without proper authorization could compromise any case they built. He thought about Raymond, about whether the man had hours or days left if he was still alive. Do it unofficially, Corbett decided. Get eyes on that platform. Document what you find. We'll worry about warrants and jurisdiction after we know what we're dealing with. Hayes nodded and reached for his radio to begin organizing the operation. As he did, Corbett's phone rang. It was Lucille. "Corbett, I've got something. I've been digging through Bernard Dupp's background. He wasn't just an insurance agent. Before that, he worked for Gulfoil, the company that owned that platform. He was there when they decommissioned it. You think he knew about the platform being used for drug drops? I think he might have been the one who set it up. I found some financial records from his estate. The man died with $400,000 in a private account, way more than an insurance agent should have accumulated. And there were regular deposits over the years, always in cash, always from untraceable sources. So Dupe was running the operation. He recruited the shrimpers, arranged the insurance policies, then had them killed after they did a few pickups. The widows collect the insurance. Dupe takes a cut. Everyone profits except the dead shrimpers. That's my working theory. But if Dupe died 2 years ago, someone else must have taken over the operation. Someone who knew about the arrangement and decided to continue it. After hanging up, Corbett shared the information with Hayes and Vidal. The picture was becoming clearer, but the identity of whoever had taken over from Dupe remained a mystery. We need to look at who had access to Dupe's business records after he died. Fado suggested his partner at the insurance agency, Paul Ducey, family members, anyone who might have discovered what he was doing and decided to keep the operation running. Corbett nodded. Vato, I want you to get warrants for DUP's business records and his personal effects, everything his estate held. Talk to Deuce again, but carefully. If he's involved, we don't want to spook him. What about you? I'm going out to that platform with the Coast Guard. The boat that Hayes assembled was a rigid hull, inflatable, fast and maneuverable, designed for boarding operations. Besides Hayes and Corbett, they brought 2 Coast Guard boarding officers and a photographer to document whatever they found. They left the dock at 1 p.m., the autumn sun beating down on the Gulf waters. The platform appeared on the horizon after about 40 minutes, a skeletal structure rising from the water like the ribs of some ancient sea creature. Rust streaked its surfaces, and several of the support legs showed damage from years of hurricanes and neglect. Warning signs declared it off limits, property of the bankruptcy court, dangerous to approach. They circled the structure once, looking for any obvious signs of recent activity. The platform deck was about 30 ft above the waterline, accessible by a rusted ladder that looked questionable at best. Below the waterline, the support legs disappeared into the murky green depths. We're going to need divers if we want to search underwater, Hay said. But let's check the deck first. 2 boarding officers scaled the ladder, testing each rung before putting their full weight on it. Corbett watched from the boat, his hand resting unconsciously on his service weapon. When the officers reached the deck and signaled all clear, Hayes and Corbett followed. The platform deck was maybe 50 ft square, covered in rusted equipment and abandoned machinery. A small control shack stood at one corner, its windows broken, its door hanging open. Seabirds had taken over the structure, their droppings covering every surface. The place felt desolate, forgotten. Exactly the kind of location where illegal activity could flourish unseen. They split up to search the deck, carefully navigating around corroded metal and unstable flooring. Corbett made his way to the control shack and stepped inside. The interior was gutted, all valuable equipment long since removed or stolen. But in one corner, protected from the weather, he found something that made his pulse quicken. A waterproof duffel bag, the kind used by commercial divers. It was sealed and relatively new, no more than a few years old based on the condition. Corbett called Hayes over, and they photographed the bag in place before opening it. Inside were dive weights, a dive light, and several heavy-duty carabiners. At the bottom was a waterproof notebook, with entries dated over the past 2 years. The entries were brief, noting dates and times, GPS coordinates, and cryptic references to packages and pickups. The most recent entry was dated 4 days ago. the day before Raymond Milan disappeared. This proves the platform was being used for drug operations, Hayes said. But it doesn't tell us who's running it now. They continued searching and found more evidence of recent activity. Fresh scuff marks on the ladder despite the rust, suggesting regular use. Cigarette butts that were recent enough to still have color. A plastic water bottle with a brand that hadn't existed when the platform was operational. But the most significant discovery came when one of the boarding officers called out from near the edge of the deck. He was pointing at something attached to one of the support legs just below the waterline. Corbett and Hayes crawled to the edge and looked down. Secured to the leg with industrial straps was another waterproof container, this one much larger. It floated just below the surface, invisible unless you knew where to look. The officer used a gaff hook to pull it up. And when they opened it, they found what Corbett had been expecting. 20 kilos of cocaine wrapped in plastic and vacuum sealed. That's probably $1 million wholesale, Hayes said quietly. Someone's going to be very unhappy it's missing. They photographed everything, documented the exact location and collected the evidence. As they were preparing to leave, Corbett noticed something else. Scratched into the metal of the platform deck, partially obscured by rust, were initials RMACLLT, Raymond Malansong, Antoine Charami, Louis Thibodeau. The three shrimpers had been here had marked their presence on this structure. Whether it was defiance, documentation, or just boredom during the long waits for pickups, Corbett couldn't say. But it confirmed that all three had been involved in whatever operation ran through this platform. On the boat ride back to shore, Corbett's phone buzzed with a text from Vidal. Got the warrants. Found something in Duriwi's files you need to see. Meet me at the office. By the time they docked, and Corbett drove back to the sheriff's department in Homer, it was nearly 6 p.m. Vidal was waiting in the conference room surrounded by file boxes. What did you find? Partnership agreement between Bernard Dupy and Paul Doucet. They weren't just colleagues at the insurance agency. They were 50-50 partners in a company called GF Coast Risk Management. That company held the decommissioning contract for the old platform. Corbett felt something cold settle in his chest. Deuce knew about the platform. He had access to it legally through the decommissioning contract. Right, and look at this. Vidal pulled out another document. After Dupy died, Doucet inherited his share of GF Coast Risk Management. The window behind the desk stood open, curtains moving in the evening breeze. He ran, Vidal said, moving to the window. Fire escape goes down to the alley. Corbett radioed the backup units to start searching the area, but he already knew they were too late. Deuce had been watching for them, had seen them coming and had fled before they could take him into custody. He was smart, organized, and now he knew the authorities were closing in. They searched the office thoroughly. Deuce had taken his laptop, but his filing cabinets were still full. Vidal began going through them, while Corbett examined the desk. In the bottom drawer he found a burner phone and a small notebook with names and numbers. Raymond Melanson's name was there along with a notation. October 12th final pickup. The date Raymond had disappeared. Below his name were other names Corbett didn't recognize, probably other shrimpers who'd been recruited for the operation, and at the bottom of the page, a phone number with the notation cleanup. Corbett felt sick. The cleanup note suggested that Raymond's disappearance had been planned, that Doucet had arranged for someone to take care of the problem when Raymond became a liability. Whether Raymond was already dead or being held somewhere, that notation suggested his time was running out. We need to find Deuce immediately, Corbett told Vidal, and we need to find whoever he hired to do his dirty work. Raymond might still be alive. They spent the next 3 hours coordinating a manhunt. State police were alerted. Doucet's photo was distributed to all law enforcement agencies in the region. His bank accounts were frozen. The Coast Guard was notified in case he tried to flee by boat. Every asset at Corbett's disposal was mobilized, but as night fell and there was still no sign of Doucet, Corbett grew increasingly worried. The man had planned his escape, probably had it ready for months in case something went wrong. He could be anywhere in Louisiana by now, or already across state lines. Around 10 p.m., Corbett received a call from Lucille. I've been going through Bernard Dup's medical records. He didn't die of natural causes. What do you mean? You signed the death certificate. I did based on what appeared to be a straightforward heart attack, but I just reviewed the autopsy findings more carefully. There were anomalies in his blood work that I dismissed at the time because the overall picture looked like cardiac failure. But now, knowing what we know about his involvement in this operation, those anomalies make more sense. You think he was murdered? I think he was poisoned with something that mimicked a heart attack. It would have been almost impossible to detect without specifically looking for it. And at the time, no one had reason to look. He was overweight, a smoker, high-stress job. A heart attack was the obvious conclusion. Let me guess, Paul Doucet was with him when he died. According to the witness statements, yes, Doucet found the body and called 911. He was very helpful, very cooperative, very concerned. Classic behavior for someone who'd just committed murder. Corbett thanked her and hung up. So Doucet hadn't just taken over the operation from Dupuy. He'd killed his partner to seize full control. And if he'd killed once to protect the operation, he wouldn't hesitate to kill again. The question now was whether Raymond Millinson was already dead, or if there was still time to save him, and whether Corbett could find Doucet before the insurance agent disappeared completely. His phone rang again. This time it was Hayes from the Coast Guard. "Sheriff, we've got something. A commercial fisherman just reported seeing someone matching Doucet's description at a marina in Duloc. He was getting onto a boat with another man. Looked like they were preparing to head out into the Gulf. Duloc, the same community where Raymond Mellison lived, where his boat had been docked." Corbett felt certainty settle over him. Juice was going back to the platform, back to the scene of his crimes. Maybe to retrieve evidence, maybe to complete whatever he'd started with Raymond. "I'm heading there now. Have your response boat meet me at the Duloc Marina." The drive south was the longest 30 minutes of Corbett's life. He pushed the patrol unit as fast as he dared on the dark bayou roads. Lights flashing, mind racing through scenarios. If Dookie was heading to the platform, he might be taking Raymond there to dispose of him, the same way he'd disposed of the others. Or Raymond might already be there, held captive, waiting for rescue that might come too late. The Duloc Marina was dark when Corbett arrived. Just a few security lights illuminating the docks. The Coast Guard boat was already there. Hayes standing on the dock with his crew. They'd spotted the vessel Deuce had taken, tracked it on radar heading southeast toward the platform. "We can intercept them before they reach the structure," Hayes said. "But Sheriff, if there's going to be a confrontation, my people are trained for maritime boarding operations. You should stay with the backup team, no chance. Raymond Millinson is my responsibility." "I'm going." They boarded the Coast Guard vessel and headed out into the dark Gulf at full speed. The night was moonless, the water black and featureless. They ran without lights, navigating by GPS and radar, watching the blip that represented Doucet's boat growing closer on the screen. 20 minutes out from the marina, they spotted the boat visually. It was idling near the platform, a spotlight playing across the structure support legs. Corbett could see two figures on deck, one holding the light, the other doing something at the stern. "Coast Guard, cut your engine and prepare to be boarded." Hayes' voice boomed across the water through the loudspeaker. The response was immediate. The spotlight swung toward them, blinding in the darkness. Then gunfire, muzzle flashes bright in the night, bullets snapping through the air around the Coast Guard's boat. "Get down!" Hayes shouted, and everyone dropped to the deck as the Coast Guard crew returned fire. The firefight lasted maybe 30 seconds, both boats rocking in the swells, shots echoing across the empty Gulf, then silence. The spotlight on Deuce's boat went dark. Through the night vision equipment, they could see one figure slumped on the deck, the other with hands raised. They approached cautiously, weapons trained on the surrendering figure. As they drew close enough to illuminate the boat with their own lights, Corbett saw Paul Doucet standing with his hands up, blood on his shirt. The second figure, the one who'd been shooting, was down. Dead or wounded, Corbett couldn't tell from this distance. But in the stern of the boat, bound and gagged but alive, was Raymond Mellison. The Coast Guard boarding team secured Doucet, while medics attended to Raymond Mellison. The man was dehydrated, bruised, and terrified, but alive. He'd been held captive for 4 days in the cabin of Doucet's personal boat, bound and gagged, listening to the sounds of the bayou through the hall while his captor decided what to do with him. When the medics removed the gag, Raymond's first words were asking about his wife. "She's fine," Corbett assured him. "Worried sick, but fine. We'll get you to her soon." The second man on the boat, the one who'd opened fire on the Coast Guard, was dead. 2 rounds had hit him center mass during the exchange. His name, according to the identification they found, was Marcus Guedry, a commercial fisherman from Montagut, who'd apparently been working as Duque's enforcer. A search of his phone would later reveal communications, arranging the deaths of Antoine Cherami and Louis Thibideau, along with detailed plans for disposing of Raymond that had been interrupted. They transported everyone back to shore, where ambulances were waiting. Raymond was taken to Terrebonne General Hospital for observation. Deuce was taken to the same hospital under armed guard, where he'd be treated and then transferred to the parish jail. Marcus Guedry's body was transported to the coroner's office, where Lucille would conduct an autopsy, though the cause of death was obvious. It was nearly 3 a.m. when Corbett finally made it to the hospital to check on Raymond. Marie Melisson was in the room with her husband, holding his hand while he slept under sedation. She looked up when Corbett entered, her eyes red from crying, but also filled with something that might have been gratitude, or might have been anger at the system that had failed to protect her husband in the first place. "Mrs. Melanson, I'm sorry for everything you and Raymond went through." "Are you?" Her voice was quiet but sharp. "Because from where I'm sitting, Sheriff, it looks like this could have been prevented. 3 men died before you figured out what was happening. My husband almost became the 4th. How many more would there have been if Raymond hadn't been lucky?" Corbett had no good answer. She was right. The pattern had been there for anyone who looked closely enough. But no one had looked until Raymond disappeared. The system had failed Antoine Cherami and Louis Thibideau, treating their deaths as isolated accidents rather than pieces of a larger crime. "You're right. We should have caught this sooner. All I can say is that we caught it now, and the people responsible are going to face justice." Marie looked at her sleeping husband. "Justice won't bring back the years we lost worrying about money. It won't erase what Raymond went through these past 4 days, but I suppose it's something." Corbett left the hospital as dawn was breaking over humor. He drove to the sheriff's department, where Vidal was waiting with coffee and the beginnings of the paperwork that would consume the next several weeks. DEA is sending agents down from Baton Rouge. Vidal reported FBI wants to be involved because of the insurance fraud angle. State police are coordinating with the Coast Guard on the drug trafficking charges. This is going to be a jurisdictional mess. Let them sort it out. Our job was to find Raymond Melasso and stop whoever was killing our shrimpers. We did that. Over the next few days, the full scope of Paul Duque's operation became clear. Working with Bernard Dupy, he'd been running drugs through the platform for nearly a decade, recruiting desperate shrimpers to make pickups during their normal fishing trips. The insurance angle had been Duo's innovation, a way to profit twice from each recruited shrimper. First from their labor, and then from their deaths when they became too knowledgeable or too much of a risk. Marcus Guedry had been the muscle, the one who made the actual killings look like accidents. He'd sabotaged Louis Thibideau's boat in 2010, causing it to sink in deep water where it would never be found. He'd drugged Antoine Cherami in 2016 and pushed him overboard from his own boat, leaving it running to make it look like an accidental fall. And he'd planned to take Raymond far out into the Gulf and weight his body down where sharks and currents would ensure he was never found. The notebook from the platform revealed names of other shrimpers who'd been recruited over the years. Some had completed their service and been paid off. Others had grown suspicious and quit before getting in too deep. But Antoine, Louis, and Raymond had learned too much, had seen too many faces, had become liabilities that needed permanent elimination. The investigation also uncovered the extent of Duque's criminal network. He'd been moving drugs for a Mexican cartel, using the abandoned platform as a transfer point, because it was far enough offshore to avoid casual observation, but close enough to the coast for easy pickup. The shrimpers were perfect mules, legitimate businessmen with reason to be in the area, unlikely to attract Coast Guard attention. When Bernard Dewey had gotten cold feet and wanted to shut down the operation, Duque had seen an opportunity. He'd poisoned his partner with a substance that mimicked cardiac arrest, inherited the entire operation, and continued running it for another 2 years until Raymond's disappearance had finally drawn enough attention to unravel the whole scheme. 3 weeks after Raymond's rescue, Corbett attended a community meeting in Dulac. The small fishing community had been devastated by the revelations. learning that one of their own, Marcus Guidry, had been a killer, and that the insurance agent they'd all trusted had been running a drug operation. The meeting was held in the community center, a simple building that served as the social hub for the area. Corbett stood before a crowd of maybe 200 people, shrimpers and their families, people who'd known the victims, people who were trying to understand how this had happened in their community. "I know there are questions," Corbett began. "Questions about how Paul Doucet and Marcus Gray operated here for years without being caught. Questions about why the earlier deaths weren't investigated more thoroughly. Questions about trust and safety, and whether anyone in authority was paying attention." He paused, looking out at the weathered faces of men and women who made their living from the Gulf, who understood risk and hardship in ways most people never would. "The truth is that Doucet exploited the exact qualities that make this community strong. Your independence, your reluctance to involve outside authorities, your loyalty to each other. He knew that shrimpers don't ask for help easily, that you solve your own problems, that you protect your own. He used those strengths against you." A man in the back called out, "How do we know there aren't others like him? How do we know who to trust?" "You don't, not completely. But what you can do is talk. When something feels wrong, when someone's asking you to do things that don't sit right, speak up. Call us. We can't help if we don't know there's a problem." After the meeting, several shrimpers approached Corbett privately. They told him about times when Dupuy or Doucet had approached them with offers of easy money, about friends who'd disappeared over the years in circumstances that now seemed suspicious. Most of these cases were too old to prosecute, but they helped fill in the picture of an operation that had been much larger than anyone had initially realized. One conversation stuck with Corbett particularly hard. An older shrimper named Henry Biron pulled him aside and spoke quietly. "My son, he disappeared 8 years ago, working the Gulf, never came back. Coast Guard said it was an accident, that he probably fell overboard. But my boy was careful, Sheriff. He knew those waters like he knew his own face. I never believed he just fell. After hearing about what Duca and Guidry were doing, I got to wondering if maybe my son got involved with them too." Corbett took Henry's information and promised to look into it, though he suspected the truth would never be fully known. How many other disappearances over the years had been attributed to the dangerous nature of Gulf fishing when they'd actually been murderers? How many families had been left wondering, never getting closure, never knowing their loved ones had been victims of a criminal conspiracy? Paul Doucet's trial began in the spring. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder for Antoine Cherami, Louis Thibodeau, and Bernard Dupuy, plus attempted murder for Raymond Mellis, drug trafficking, insurance fraud, and a host of other charges. The prosecution had an overwhelming amount of evidence. The notebook from the platform, financial records showing the drug money, testimony from Raymond about his captivity, and forensic evidence linking Marcus Guidry to the earlier deaths. Ducey's defense attorney argued that his client had been coerced by the Mexican cartel, that he'd been afraid for his life, that the murders had been committed by Guidry acting independently. But the evidence of planning, of the poisoning of Bernard Dewey, of the calculated nature of the insurance fraud scheme, painted a picture of a man in full control of his criminal enterprise. Corbett testified for 2 days, walking the jury through the investigation, explaining how the pattern had emerged, describing the scene on the boat when they'd found Raymond bound and helpless. He watched Duty sitting at the defense table, still maintaining that mild-mannered insurance agent facade, and marveled at how completely the man had fooled everyone. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Deuce was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. As the judge read the sentence, Duquet's mask finally slipped. He turned and looked directly at Corbett. And in that moment, the sheriff saw not the respectable businessman, but the cold calculator who'd viewed human lives as nothing more than assets to be exploited and discarded. After the trial, Corbett visited the Melanson house one last time. Raymond was back on his boat, though he'd sold the Miss Evangeline and bought a smaller vessel that he used for day trips close to shore. The trauma of his captivity had changed him, made him more cautious, less willing to venture far from home. But he was alive, which was more than could be said for Antoine Chériam and Louis Thibodeau. "How are you doing?" Corbett asked as they sat on Raymond's porch, watching the bayou flow past. Some days better than others. I have nightmares about being in that boat tied up, listening to Ducey and Guidry talking about where to dump my body. But I'm here, Sheriff. I get to see my grandkids grow up. That's more than Antoine and Louis got. I'm sorry we didn't figure it out sooner. Maybe if we had, maybe, Raymond interrupted. But maybe not. These guys were smart, careful. They'd been doing it for years without getting caught. You can't blame yourself for that. But Corbett did blame himself, at least partially. The warning signs had been there. The pattern of disappearances in the same area, the insurance policies, the platform that everyone knew was being used for something illicit. If he'd looked closer sooner, Antoine and Louis might still be alive. As summer turned to fall and the shrimping season continued, life in Terrebonne Parish slowly returned to normal. The platform was finally demolished, the Coast Guard making it a priority to remove the structure that had served as a focal point for criminal activity. The insurance agency where Deuce had worked closed down. Unable to survive the scandal, new agents moved into the space. Working to rebuild trust with a community that had been badly burned, Corbett continued his work, investigating crimes, maintaining order, trying to protect a parish that sometimes didn't want to be protected. But the Melisson case had changed him. He'd learned that the most dangerous criminals weren't always the obvious ones, that respectability could be a mask, and that the systems designed to protect people could sometimes be the very mechanisms used to exploit them. On quiet nights when he had trouble sleeping, Corbett would think about the three initials scratched into the platform deck, THARTMACLT. 3 men who'd made mistakes, who'd gotten involved in something they shouldn't have, but who hadn't deserved to die for those mistakes. Their names would fade from public memory, replaced by new stories, new scandals, new tragedies. But Corbett would remember them, would carry their weight alongside all the other cases that haunted law enforcement officers who'd been in the job long enough to see the worst of what people could do to each other. The Gulf kept its secrets, but not all of them. Some had been dragged into the light, exposed, accounted for. 3 families had answers now, even if those answers brought little comfort. The shrimpers of Terrebonne Parish could work their waters, knowing that at least this particular threat had been eliminated. But Corbett knew as he watched the seasons change and the boats go out and return, that the Gulf would always have more secrets. More operations would rise to replace the one he'd shut down. More desperate people would make choices they couldn't undo. More families would wait for boats that never came home. His job was to be there when it happened, to look closely enough to see the patterns others missed, to refuse to accept the easy explanation when something darker lurked beneath the surface, to remember that every missing person was someone's husband or father or son, that every case marked the end of a life and the beginning of a family's long grief. The shrimping towns continued their rhythm, their boats heading out at dawn and returning at dusk, their crews working waters that were both generous and treacherous. And in his office in Humor, Sheriff Corbett Budrow kept watch, knowing that vigilance was all that stood between the Gulf's secrets and the people who deserved to know the truth.